How do you sleep at night with $1.4 billion debt over your head?
It was $2 billion about a year and a half ago. I owed $2 billion, so I've already paid off about $500 million. So I could, I was even sleeping then. I'm paying those debts off. It'll only take me about 10 or 15 years to work out of this hole, but I intend to do it. I'm getting a bill consolidation loan, so I can pay them off with one big monthly payment.
But come on, you joke about it. I mean...
Why not joke about it? What's the point? What am I supposed to do? Cry about it? I got that debt because I bought all these movies. I knew what I was doing. It's just like if you go buy a Cadillac and finance it. It's the same exact thing. Everybody's in debt. Didn't you know that?
Some say you got snookered on the United Artists MGM deal, that you spent too much for what you got.
If I'd have thought that I could have bought it for less, I would have certainly bought it for less. I mean, if you really knew me well, I don't throw money away, but it was like Rembrandt's. I think those movies are irreplaceable and that they're works of art and that they were worth a little bit more, and I'm going to make it work.
In the late 1980s, right around the time Ted Turner made his Caesarean choice to stop his assault on CBS's BlackRock and instead head west to Hollywood to buy MGM, loading Turner Broadcasting, the company bearing his name, with mountains of debt. A young man was also rising fast in another high-speed battlefield. Now, this young man was a boxer. He was known for inspiring fear through his actions as he'd walk to the ring in plain black shorts with a towel over his head. You want intimidation, this was it. And as he kept knocking out men many years older than himself, one after another, by 1986, at just 20 years of age, he stood on top of the boxing world. A year later, in 1987, the same year Ted Turner's MGM debt started coming due, the heavyweight champion of the world, Iron Mike Tyson, was about to face Tyrell Biggs, who'd been talking plenty of trash about his young, brash opponent. In their war of words, Iron Mike responded like a Nobel Poet Laureate, explaining his opponent's strategy by saying something along the lines of, quote, "Everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth," end quote. Now, if you didn't know it was Mike Tyson, you could imagine Ted Turner saying something along those very same lines, right? Ted had a plan, and now he'd been punched in the mouth. Now it wasn't about how hard he'd been hit. It was about how he'd respond, how he'd get up, and how he'd keep going. I've said this before, but this season of Media Moguls could very well be called Ted Turner Kept Going. Well, now that Ted Turner had finally been hit, and as some of his critics and opponents thought, knocked down to size, we'll get to see just how he responded. Would his fate mirror Icarus, who flew too close to the sun? Or was this just a stumble as Ted doubled down like Sisyphus, pushing a boulder made of his ambitions, dreams, and Turner Broadcasting's assets back up that mountain? Would Ted get back up? Or would he let things fall apart like so many other one-trick media ponies do? This episode is about getting back up, pushing back, battling back, doubling down, and winding up for that big knockout shot at the haters. Years later, Ted reflected on his bad MGM deal, saying, quote, "At the time, the MGM deal was a mistake. I mean, if you say, I just made a deal that requires me to give away half my company, when that wasn't the intent of the deal, well, it might work out in the future. But at the time, it clearly was a miscalculation." He later said, "I may make a mistake someday, but buying MGM wasn't one of them," end quote. Ultimately, Ted's decision to walk away from his no-cash CBS bid and into Kurt Kerkorian's arms would lead him to team up with his cable cowboy friends at one of the most opportune times in media history. Despite constant cash flow problems from Ted's endless new ventures, Turner Broadcasting kept expanding. By 1986, even though the stock was volatile, TBS, Ted's flagship network, had become a powerhouse, reaching 36 million homes, and was the largest, most profitable advertising-supported network on cable, generating about $70 million in operating cash flow that year. But for Ted, it was never about winning the battles, only to lose the war. No, he always had his eyes on the bigger prize, because Ted was playing the long game. Now, remember in the last episode when Ted said, quote, "The game I'm in is building assets," end quote. Well, with that mindset, he could just as easily end his pursuit of CBS and head west to buy MGM. It was grow or die time, and he had a chance to lower the cost of all of his programming. He explained, quote, "We're protecting WTBS. It's an extremely valuable asset, but its future was clouded," end quote. Even in 1986, nearly half of the programming on the Superstation was a mix of sports, specials, and reruns of old TV shows like I Love Lucy, Gilligan's Island, and Leave It to Beaver. The other half was old movies. And when asked about TBS's programming, Ted said, quote, "I'd rather have good old programming than bad new programming," end quote. But as we discussed in the last episode, there was a problem. Remember, the Hollywood studios, who own most of the movies Ted wanted to air on the Superstation, kept raising their licensing fees, making the rising costs harder and harder for Turner Broadcasting to justify. Bill Bevins, Turner's CFO at the time, even estimated that if those fees kept climbing, TBS's operating profits could drop from 40% of sales in 1985 to as low as 10% by 1990. That's what made the MGM deal so critical. Ted Turner basically saw two options for Turner Broadcasting: gain more leverage as a program buyer, like CBS, or own the content himself. So he can buy a network like CBS, but, that failed. Or he could buy a studio which produces the programming and own the content himself, which made MGM seem like the perfect solution, right? It gave Turner Broadcasting a massive library of 3,650 movies, including classics like The Wizard of Oz, Citizen Kane, Gone with the Wind, Casablanca, and much more. Ted even bragged, quote, "We've got 35% of the great films of all time. We've got Spencer Tracy and Jimmy Cagney working for us from the grave," end quote. By his estimation, about 1,000 of those movies had lasting commercial value, and he planned to air them on the Superstation forever. And while some of the movies were still licensed to other broadcasters, meaning they wouldn't be available immediately on the Superstation, Ted didn't really seem to care. To him, that was a minor step back, especially with his long-term approach, right? One CNN executive said it best, quote, "Ted's mind is always 5 or 10 years down the road. Right now, he's probably living in 1995, end quote. Still, everyone, and I mean everyone, thought Ted had overpaid for MGM at $1.6 billion. And that's not including all the debt. It's closer to $2.1 billion. Remember, one anonymous Hollywood insider even said, quote, "Turner got the worst screwing in the history of American business," end quote. So by 1978, almost 30 years after cable started as a fix for people with no TV reception in remote areas, remember the big tower on top of the mountain in Pennsylvania that just pulled broadcast TV out of the sky and how they wired it down into Latrobe, Pennsylvania? We talked about that in episode 2. Cable in 1978 was in 19% of American homes, with only 8 cable networks. And 6 years later, by 1984, that figure had doubled to 40% of homes, and cable didn't stop there. It just kept growing. What's wild is that this explosion happened during one of the worst recessions since World War II. So what does that tell you? Turns out people like more options. They like being catered to. They like when people think about them. Even as Americans were struggling with out-of-control inflation, before Reaganomics kicked in, people were starving for more TV. They needed cable. They wanted their MTV. They wanted more options like 24/7 movies, exclusive stand-up comedy specials on HBO, the ability to watch sports, not just the big national teams, but your local team like the Atlanta Braves on the Superstation. You have cartoons on Nickelodeon and nonstop sports all day, every day on ESPN, including highlights on SportsCenter, right? So how could they not love that? By the early 1980s, cable had become a real competitor to the broadcast networks. Its lobby group, the National Cable Television Association, pushed hard for federal laws that would free cable companies from what they saw as unfair local regulations. By 1986, new legislation was on the way, giving cable more freedom and room to grow. The shackles were being let loose. The cable cowboys, led by guys like John Malone, were hungry for bigger opportunities and new ways to expand their empires. Then came Ted Turner's debt crisis with MGM, a problem that wasn't just Ted's, but a potential threat to the entire cable industry. And you're probably wondering how that's possible. We're going to discuss it. If they could rein Ted in, Ted's kind of a maverick, and share in his upside, there could be huge success down the line for everyone, right? In June 1986, as MGM was being sold off in pieces, bids started coming in for everything except for the film library, which Ted was going to keep. So Ted toured the studio with John Malone, Time Inc.'s Nick Nicholas, and HBO's Michael Fuchs, before sitting down to figure out how could he actually save his media empire and make the MGM deal, including the studio, work. And as they talked, Ted began scribbling numbers on the back of an envelope, trying to figure out a way to keep the entire thing. One executive remembered, quote, "I was thinking about the way our company would do it. 9 million accountants, 10,000 lawyers. Here was Ted doing this deal on the back of an envelope," end quote. Ted was old school, and the times, they were a-changin'. Even in the mid-1980s, that moment kind of sums up exactly who Ted Turner was. One of the last of his kind, a Renaissance man and a true cable cowboy. He'd made his bed with the risky MGM deal, loading Turner Broadcasting up to the gills with debt. And if he couldn't pay it off, he'd be packing his bags. Now, in the last episode, I briefly broke down Ted's limited options. He was facing a mounting debt and those looming preferred shares that could convert to common shares, meaning if he couldn't pay it off, he'd lose control of his own company, the company bearing his name. Rather than selling individual assets like CNN, he figured his best option was to sell part of Turner Broadcasting. But to who? By late 1986, the stakes had never been higher. Ted knew he wouldn't be able to meet his obligations to Kirk Kerkorian, and the possibility of losing control of Turner Broadcasting, not only did it feel more real than ever, it was more real than ever. Ted could feel Kerkorian closing in on his empire. Ted's CFO, Bill Bevins, who had been instrumental in structuring Turner's deals and acting as Ted's steady, rational counterbalance for years, had finally run out of solutions. He eventually left Turner Broadcasting in November of '87 after 8 years of working for Ted. One of his associates told the Los Angeles Times, quote, "I guess he got tired of being between a rock and a hard place," end quote. So with financing from Wall Street out of the equation, remember, he raised the money from Drexel, Ted turned to the guys he knew best, the cable cowboys, starting with the cable godfather himself, Bill Daniels, who, if you remember in episode 5, which is part 1 of our CNN story, Daniels had helped Ted bridge a $3 million shortfall when his Charlotte TV station sale almost fell through. A few years later, Daniels was key in arranging Ted's buyout of CNN's short-lived competitor, satellite news channel from ABC Westinghouse. But by late 1986, as the cable industry was booming, Ted's MGM troubles threatened to cause problems for everyone. Daniels and Malone feared TBS, or worse, CNN, might fall into the wrong hands. Someone not in their cable circle, or, even worse, Rupert Murdoch's hands, who just launched the Fox Broadcasting Network and was on the hunt for more media properties. Now, Daniels, of course, knew Ted had been in talks with the networks who were interested in owning part of or all of CNN. And that would be a loss for the cable guys, right? Because they don't like the fact that the broadcast networks could compete or join the cable fray. And of course, everyone knew about the $15 share price trigger, the one that if the stock dropped below $15, then Kerkorian could basically get control of Turner Broadcasting. The pieces were all in motion. Blood was in the water. And the real question wasn't whether TBS would survive, but who would own it, and whether Ted Turner himself would make it out alive. 1987 was shaping up to be a very interesting year for Ted Turner, Turner Broadcasting, and the cable industry. Building an independent media company is a hell of a thing, but doing it with a partner or a group of partners, well, that can be both a great thing or a bad thing. I'm Web Barr, and this is the 10th episode of Media Moguls, the Ted Turner Saga. Cable's cowboy gets bailed out.
When the legend becomes fact, print the legend.
What we're doing right here on this spot is the greatest advance in television since television was invented.
They're risk takers, rule breakers, and empire builders. These are the stories of the visionaries who transform media forever.
Whatever I have is being put at risk on this project, and if it's not successful, I'll be looking for a job.
Going to Bernard Shaw.
Tear down this wall.
From Hivar, this is Media Moguls.
We won't be signing off until the world ends. We'll be on, we will cover it live.
In 2001, John Malone told a similar version of Ted's KKN story to Trig Marin.
When Ted Turner kind of got himself a little over his head, and with Mr. Krikorian buying MGM, and I'll never forget the morning the phone rang, and it was Ted. It was about 6 in the morning, and I was just barely coming awake, and he's screaming on the phone, "You got to do something." He says, "You got to do something. If you don't do something, it's going to be the KNN." And I said, "What the hell's the KNN, Ted?" And he says, "The Krikorian News Network." So, you know, once again, I think it's testimony to how this industry works together that we were able to put together a refinancing plan for Ted to take Krikorian out, leave Ted in hard control of his company, and do well by everybody who invested in the enterprise. Eventually, of course, Ted was able to develop additional channels within CNN or Turner Broadcasting Systems. He developed TNT and some other channels, and the Cartoon Channel eventually.
Ted later admitted, quote, "Calling on John Malone turned out to be the best thing I could have done. Not only did he have a strong grasp of financial issues and an incredible knack for deal-making, but he also had a burning desire to see us all in the cable industry succeed. TCI didn't yet have an investment in Turner, but John already considered us to be on the same team. Our collective fight was against the broadcast networks, and while our immediate issue was losing control of a Hollywood studio, John could envision our assets eventually flip into a Big Three broadcaster. And if ABC, NBC, or CBS added strong cable channels to their portfolio, their leverage over the industry would be enhanced significantly. As hard as it might have been for me to have outsiders own a significant stake in the company, I did believe that TCI and the cable companies would be good partners. I listened to my father's advice about getting to know your customers, and in the 10 years since we had launched the Superstation, nearly all of them had become friends. For example, the past summer I had flown the group to Moscow for the Goodwill Games, and we had a fabulous time together. The industry was full of solid businessmen, and while our negotiations were always challenging, we knew we needed each other. My sense was if they also had a direct financial interest in our success, we could work collaboratively on new networks, and we'd have a much better chance of launching these channels with distribution and subscriber fees. If there was ever a group that I'd welcome into our company as investors and directors, this was it." End quote. So after talking to Bill Daniels, Ted quickly followed up with John Malone. He knew he had to do something, anything, to save his company from Krikorian and would-be suitors like Rupert Murdoch, who, no doubt about it, were circling, waiting for their chance to swoop in like vultures and grab their piece of the pie. Ted saw Malone as the ideal partner. He understood the economics better than anyone, had all the cable connections, a ton of distribution, and most importantly, Malone knew how to get a deal done. He'd gotten thousands of deals done in the previous decade at TCI. It was kind of his modus operandi. And this was the kind of deal that wouldn't just help Ted, but the entire cable industry. You know, a rising tide lifts all boats. But before we get to that, we need to understand why the cable cowboys would even consider bailing Ted out. And to do that, we need to look at the Cable Act of 1984. And then we'll talk about John Malone and why he'd want to help Ted Turner out in the first place. So, in 1984, Congress passed the Cable Communication Policy Act, the first national law to officially define the government's role over cable TV. This law opened the door to a new era of growth for cable, since it gave cable access to financial markets, fresh programming ideas, and opened up billions more in untapped revenue. When the Cable Act went into effect in 1986, it gave cities the right to grant franchises, require public access channels, and collect benefits from cable operators. But it also shifted most oversight from local governments to the federal government, a huge win for cable, so that they wouldn't have to have inconsistent city-by-city negotiations. Prior to this, all the cable operators, the guys who have the cable systems, Charters of the World, TCIs, they were basically having to operate on a local-by-local basis, having to work out deals in each municipality and bid versus others. They couldn't get franchises yet, and, there's a lot of bribery, stuff like that. But the rules weren't defined. Imagine having to negotiate each of your deals and all the channels that are going to be on these stations and how much it's going to cost on a market-by-market basis, town by town. Now it's just one clear rule book. This is huge. The law capped franchise fees at 5% of revenues, making it cheaper and easier to operate. Renewing a 10-year franchise became almost automatic, giving existing players a major advantage, the ability to charge more. So that's why you only see one cable company in different cities, right? Think about it. With clear rules and limits on how much cities could charge to operate in that town, extortion went down. Operators now knew how much they could grow without tripping over red tape. And even better for cable, this law kept the giant phone companies, the AT&Ts of the world, out of the game, since it banned them from owning cable systems in their own service areas. So even if cable companies failed to meet service standards, which meant delivering a good product, they still had a monopoly locally, right? Which meant no competition from telecom for years. But the biggest impact of the Cable Act was on pricing. The law stopped both federal and local governments from regulating cable rates. That meant, for the first time, cable operators could raise their prices freely, boosting their cash flow overnight. And as you know, once cable rates started going up, they never really went back down, right? So with their new basically guaranteed revenue, companies like John Malone's TCI reinvested heavily, launching new channels, expanding packages, and making cable bundles more attractive to Wall Street. So in short, the government basically gave the cable industry local monopolies everywhere they went, with more predictability and pricing power to raise the prices whenever they wanted. They were free to raise prices at will. And let me tell you, they did for the next 3 decades until streaming came along. Now, this wasn't all corruption or cable lobbying genius. Lawmakers honestly believe cable would face real competition, whether it was from broadcast networks, videotape rentals like Blockbuster, Rupert Murdoch's eventual and theoretical at the time satellite TV systems, the direct ones where each home would have its own satellite dish, and whatever new technology arose. And to be fair, a lot of this made sense at the time. Writing laws for the future is very tricky. Just ask Congress about regulating AI. You don't want to kill innovation, but you also don't want to create a monster. And if you want to know who really won this, in 1986, the president of the Cable Industries Trade Association had a framed copy of the 1984 Cable Act hanging proudly on his wall. For now, cable was free from local politics and rate controls, and its already rapid growth only accelerated from there. From 1976 to 1987, the number of networks cable operators could pull down from satellites jumped from 4 to 76. The number of cable systems across the country more than doubled to 7,900. In that same span, revenue skyrocketed from $900 million to nearly $12 billion. Cable hadn't just arrived, it had become the new norm. By 1986, CNN alone was reaching 26 million homes, up from just 1.7 million at launch. And in 1987, ESPN made history for cable when they signed a 3-year, $150 million deal with the NFL. It was their first partnership with cable. Getting an NFL deal has always been a sign that you've made it as a broadcaster. It means that they trust you and your reach and your audience and your ability to protect the shield. Like Amazon getting the NFL a few years ago, that was a big freaking deal. Fox getting the NFL in 1993 was a big freaking deal, even if Murdoch overpaid. And back in 1987, this was a huge milestone for cable. Cable's rise was fueled by what the big three networks failed to offer: variety. For decades, the big three had given the same predictable programming lineup, and cable broke that mold, offering more channels, more voices, and more choice. And we've discussed all this at length, so I'm not going to keep going. But what the Cable Act of 1984 did was take all that disruption and really throw gas on the fire. Cable operators reinvested profits into new programming, chasing every niche they could as long as there was an audience there. Sure, those same costs eventually led to the bloated cable bundle that everyone seemed to hate in the late 2000s. But in the 80s and 90s, Americans loved cable television. In the same 2001 Syndio Institute conversation with Trig Marin, John Malone explained cable's rapid expansion, saying,
that was part of that era of we're seeing a rapid expansion in the number of subscribers and the number of subscribers with the equipment to receive multiple channels.
Right.
And that just was a wonderful bed for the creation of these new service offerings, whether it was ESPN or CNN and its variants, TBS, TNT, and so on. Mm. So the whole industry, I think, was gaining momentum and strength from this programming. Mm-hmm. Still,
and of course, I mean, it was gaining it because because the consumer liked it.
Yeah, the consumer liked it.
It was very different from what was available on commercial television.
A minute later, Malone described their mid-1980s Cable Act of 1984 battle on Capitol Hill, saying,
we had the broadcasters with us, but most of all, we had the public starting to like this thing called cable. So, even though we got beat up all the time about we charged for something that people thought they should get for free, nonetheless, it was becoming addictive in the average American household.
Right.
They just...
You were saying we had the broadcasters, you meant the publishers with us.
We had the publishers with us, broadcasters against us.
Right.
And frankly, the telephone industry is still asleep.
Yeah.
Which was a great thing for us.
Although in the 84 battle, they put up an enormous fight at the end.
At the end.
Yeah, just at the very end, but it was too late for them.
Okay. Before I dive into Ted's rescue or bailout, depending on how you look at it or who you ask, and how all that unfolded in 1987, we first need to discuss the cable cowboy himself, John Malone. Now, this isn't a full-on biography. We'll go deeper on John Malone another time because he's one of the most important media moguls ever, and he just retired. Hope you enjoy your retirement, Mr. Malone. But to skip over who John Malone is and his operating style and his business style and really like his genius, well, that would be really dumb, right? But to really understand what happened with Ted Turner after MGM, you have to understand what kind of person and businessman John Malone was at the time. And frankly, I doubt much has changed in his behavior in the nearly 40 years since the cable consortium stepped in to save Ted. You see, John Malone was, and still is, the kingmaker of both the cable world and the media world at large. He sees all the angles and plays the game differently than anyone else. At the time, Paramount CEO Martin Davis called him one of the great visionaries of our time. And another cable executive told the New Yorker's Ken Aletta that Malone pressured networks into discounting rates for placement on his cable boxes, saying, quote, he's an evil genius, end quote. Now, to understand John Malone, I want you to picture him in his rural Colorado office, just outside of Denver, where as of 2003, and likely still today, he didn't have a television in his office, which is very strange for one of, if not the most powerful people in the entire media industry. But he does have a huge model sailboat because, like Ted, that's one of his favorite hobbies. Malone's not formal, unless he has to be. Instead, he's known for wearing, the Sun Valley vest or a leather jacket, open collar shirt with loafers. But Malone is a private man. So when he speaks publicly, people tend to listen because what he says matters. Robert Thompson, a senior vice president at TCI at the time, described the company's culture back then like this, quote, an outsider culture. It's a culture that doesn't define itself as establishment. It's not Eastern. It's a Western culture, like in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Who are those guys? That's us, end quote. So yeah, the cable cowboys saw themselves as outsiders taking on the East Coast establishment. Of course, that kind of mentality rubbed some people on Capitol Hill wrong, like then Senator Al Gore. Now, Gore has always had strong opinions on Malone, especially in the late 80s, early 90s. He said, quote, John Malone is a monopolist bent on dominating the television marketplace, end quote. Gore even called him Darth Vader, but like Darth Vader, Malone has this uncanny ability to sense the future, harness the Force, and shape the world to fit his vision. In a 1993 New Yorker profile by Ken Aletta on Barry Diller's search for a new venture, which ultimately resulted in Diller taking control of QVC, Aletta highlighted Malone's vision on the rapidly shifting media landscape of the early 90s, saying Malone, quote, predicted a media landscape where cable companies operated in the phone company business and vice versa, and where network broadcasters were bought by cable and vice versa. It really all comes down to government regulations, end quote. Malone told Aletta, quote, one day soon, technology would make possible a digital compression box more powerful than any PC and will transform the TV set into an input-output device. He continued, the TV remote control will become like a computer mouse. You've got to personalize television. If there are 500 channels, you can't just give the consumer a scroll. That's the world of the future, end quote. So John Malone can kind of see the future. He's also known for not spending that much money on programming and getting the best deals ever for TCI in the 90s and the 80s. Malone's mix of business genius, financial mastery, and industry insight made him one of, if not the greatest media moguls of all time. And yet he's so understated compared to the New York executives or Hollywood's tycoons, right? By 1993, this is unreal, guys, John Malone controlled nearly 1 in 4 cable boxes in America through TCI and Liberty Media. Liberty Media is where he owns stakes in different media companies. And today it owns like F1. He held stakes in 29 cable networks, including CNN, TNT, and Discovery, along with deep ties to News Corp, which is Rupert Murdoch's parent company, Turner Broadcasting, Microsoft, and AT&T. Anything he could do to grow TCI and add more cash flow to their balance sheet, he would do. One cable exec explained Malone's influence to the New Yorker with this analogy, quote, imagine that you have all these publishing houses but only one book chain in the United States. You can write the best book, but what happens if you can't get into the bookstore? John Malone is the bookstore, end quote. For decades, Malone's maniacal focus wasn't just on growing TCI's cash flow, but on his understanding that the only way to do that was by growing the entire cable industry through both his ownership of cable systems through TCI and his investments via Liberty Media. You know, rising tide lifts all boats. And, you know, it's not necessarily the same in technology these days where everyone is doing their own thing. And yeah, they all copy each other and all that stuff, but they want to own the whole stack. Malone wants to invest into others because he knows it's going to help and it's going to get better deals for TCI in time. Okay, so we're about to tie a bow on Malone, but some people, you know, are born in the right place, but more so at the right time. They find their calling at the perfect time in history, right? Ted Turner is one, you know. The satellite sports teams are not too expensive yet. He's the first to build that fourth network, even if it's on cable. And other example, Steve Jobs, Michael Milken, who on the bus between Philadelphia and New York took all these stacks of papers and basically realized that junk bonds are not necessarily defaulting at the same rate, so they're not as risky. And these are all insights that happen at a very particular time, you know, in the 70s, right? For John Malone, that moment was cable. The future looked limitless to him, with nothing but blue skies ahead. Malone and his TCI team saw themselves as outsiders who defied New York and Hollywood power players, helping pioneer CNN, BET, and other groundbreaking networks. And they were relentless. These guys were tough negotiators. You know, you never got a sweetheart deal with TCI. And while critics like Al Gore saw Malone as Darth Vader, his peers saw him as a visionary, a brilliant, independent mind. Michael Fuchs, who was then the CEO of HBO, which was owned by Time Inc. at the time, and a member of the new Turner Broadcasting Board of Directors as part of the cable consortium that would rescue Ted Turner, had high praise for John Malone, saying, quote, the guy is brilliant. Malone knows everyone in the industry, but is a personal friend of no one. It's all business, end quote. And I would argue with that. I know that quote, probably the late 80s, early 90s, but John Malone and Ted Turner were very close friends, as evidenced by the new John Malone memoir, Born to be Wired. Still, John Malone's always been guarded. He once said, quote, being a CEO is lonely, end quote, and I can relate. It can be. You know, it's like Neil McCauley says in Heat, I am alone, but I am not lonely.
I'm alone. I am not lonely.
That's what a lot of this is. I'm talking in a closet right now, reading a script that I wrote, and I just got to hope that people love it. But John Malone prided himself on making independent decisions and doing things his own way. So one last anecdote to show Malone's drive and independence. He once recalled in his youth driving past cemeteries and noticing how all the gravestones looked the same. He told Ken Aletta, quote, nothing different, nothing distinctive, nothing unique. So I've always wanted to be different, always wanted to be unique, end quote. And I feel the same way. And all the people I just mentioned, you know, the Turners, Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, and John Malone, they're all unique. They have to be. That's the edge. Anyways, in the early days, Malone was captivated by the excitement of the cable industry, which was on the brink of explosive growth in the 70s. You can feel his enthusiasm when he described what made cable so compelling, saying, quote, so, you know, it was the industry that I would call the youthful period of the industry, a period of great energy, great creativity. People were finding the capital to pursue their opportunities, and even though there were oscillations in capital markets, still, the cable vector was pretty much straight up all through that period, and both the technology was coming along and the scale was coming up and everything was working. And so for the companies who were in it, they were receiving adequate capital returns, able to raise capital, able to reinvest. And of course, it's been the history of our industry that nobody ever takes any money out of operating the cable business. They plow everything back, plus whatever they can borrow and whatever they can raise. And people only take money out of the cable industry when they actually sell out and go away. And most of these guys aren't smart enough to stay out. They generally want to turn around and put their money back in because they haven't found another industry that's as much fun as the cable industry's been. So the industry's had a wonderful history of people enjoying it, enjoying the relationships, and wanting to stay associated with it, end quote. Like Ted, John Malone saw TBS as a part of cable's larger fight against the broadcast networks. He knew letting TBS or CNN fall into the wrong hands was a risk cable owners could not afford. Ted believed TCI and other cable companies were ideal partners. Over the years, he'd built strong relationships across the industry, and given the circumstances, he figured what better way to align their financial interests, right? You know, if they have a stake in his company, he's going to get better coverage, better distribution, right? For him, the cable system owners were the perfect investors and board members. At least ahead of time, they could launch new networks with better nearly guaranteed distribution, higher subscriber fees, and lower risk than before. You know, before with CNN, he had to go to every single cable operator. And at the time in 1979, 1980, there's less consolidation at that point. And as the 80s go along, now that they're consolidating and growing and the Cable Act of 1984 exists with local monopolies and franchises that have 10-year values, then there's even more consolidation. So it's in their best interest to want more channels. And by getting the cable guys to invest in TBS to bail him out, well, now he has a film library. Now Ted can really swing for the fences, right? Plus, they're the only partners who'd ever let Ted stay in charge of his own company. The cable guys, you know, they stuck together. We've talked about that. They know and trust him. Now, we'll talk about the terms in a second. So, on January 13th, 1987, Ted made his pitch, or appeal, to cable leaders, urging them to help save his company from falling into what he called enemy hands. Of course, he was talking about Rupert Murdoch's hands for the most part, since Murdoch was rumored to covet TBS's assets, specifically CNN. Turner Broadcasting executive Jerry Hogan said, quote, "We had enormous value to the cable industry. The worst thing that could happen to them would be that we'd sell something to Murdoch," end quote. So the stakes were really high. Remember, that preferred TBS stock, with its 14% dividend, threatened to destroy everything Ted had built over the last 17 years, and also posed a major risk to cable operators who wanted more independent programmers like Ted, especially at a time where cable was growing faster than ever. And he knows how to spin up these networks fast, and he's got a gigantic film library now, so it's in their interest to have Ted keep his company. So, right after Ted's frantic early morning phone call that January to John Malone, Malone jumped into action, and within weeks, spearheaded a bold campaign to raise $550 million from cable's biggest players to restructure TBS's debt and defuse Ted's ticking time bomb with Kerkorian. Now, it's worth noting this deal, or bailout, whichever you want to call it, was also great for Kerkorian, who was declared the richest man in Hollywood by Us magazine, with a net worth of around $600 million after the deal closed. Remember, I talked about him in the last episode and how Kerkorian was an unbelievable negotiator, but he also was great at buying and selling at the perfect time. Murdoch's really good at that too, to tell you the truth. In Call Me Ted, John Malone explained the rescue plan. Quote, "When I first looked at Ted's deal for the MGM library, it seemed to me that it was a great asset, but that Ted had gotten himself in trouble. Not necessarily that he paid too much, but he took his leverage too high, and the structure of the leverage was a problem. So we had to raise equity for him, and I became the junior investment banker to get this done. It was critically important to keep Ted independent. We didn't want to see him swallowed by anybody, especially a broadcaster. So what we were trying to do was preserve a major independent programmer for our own enlightened self-interest and for the good of the industry. And of course, that also went parallel to Ted's view of the world at the time." End quote. Tim Nair, president of Boston's Continental Cablevision, added, quote, "We felt that a financially healthy TBS was vital to our future. If we didn't rescue Turner, someone else would, and they might not share our interest in continuing the same quality of programs." End quote. Now, it doesn't take much imagination to understand why the cable providers didn't want to see Turner Broadcasting's channels, like TBS, or more importantly CNN, fall into the hands of non-cable owners such as the broadcast networks that could air them over the air for free, which would be a total disaster for their cable offerings, right? Or Murdoch, who at this point is kind of like an uncaged tiger. With Ted, they know what they're getting, and that's important. Consistency, the same programming, someone they have worked with for years. Malone agreed with Tim Nair, saying, quote, "If we hadn't rescued Ted Turner, TBS would have been bought by Rupert Murdoch, and CNN would be running Murder of the Week," end quote. Ted added, quote, "We're gonna win together or lose together. Nobody wins if you get into a war," end quote. And Ted was right, you know. So how'd the deal actually come together? Let me walk you all through it, because this part's fascinating and would shape both the long and short-term futures of TBS as an independent cable network. Now, remember Ted's first call, before he even called John Malone about KNN, went out to Bill Daniels at the end of 1986. And Daniels was concerned enough to organize a summit in Las Vegas for cable operators, where Ted could make his case to a dozen or so of the country's biggest cable operators. So, on March 25th, 1987, exactly 1 year after Ted officially closed on buying MGM, everyone met in Las Vegas. John Malone chaired the meeting. Bill Bevins kicked off the meeting with a brief financial presentation highlighting TBS's projected growth and potential, which actually impressed a lot of his cable industry peers, and Malone then followed, warning the group that Turner Broadcasting could fall into alien hands. Then Ted proposed a $550 million package of equity and debt that he'd previously worked on with Malone. This investment would buy back Kerkorian's preferred stock and allow him to restructure the junk bond debt, which would eliminate the need for any further talks with the broadcast networks who were chomping at the bit to carve up parts of Ted's cable empire. Then Ted told the room, quote, "With this investment, Turner Broadcasting will remain safely within the hands of the cable industry," end quote. After Ted's presentation, Bill Daniels, the godfather of cable, urged any reluctant operators to fall in line and back Ted's vision, which was also Malone's vision and his. Then came the time for everyone to huddle up without Ted in the room to discuss what a rescue package would look like. And when Ted returned, the cable group laid out all the conditions that came with their investment. First, TBS's board would expand to 15 members, with 8 seats for Ted and the common shareholders, and 7 seats for the cable operators. And you're probably thinking, well, that sounds kind of uneven, considering they're the ones saving Ted and injecting $550 million into the company. And you'd be right. But there was a kicker. The cable operators got special voting rights, allowing them to require a supermajority, 80% or more, on any matter not defined as being in the ordinary course of the company's business. And what would a matter not defined in the ordinary course of the company's business be? Well, it's things like the creation of new cable channels, major acquisitions, purchases, really the kind of things that Ted has been doing for the last 10 years, growing Turner Broadcasting, or at least trying to, right? And that wasn't all. They also required approval from 12 of the 15 directors, or a supermajority of 80% or more, on any expense over $2 million. In other words, the cable cowboys had Ted on a $2 million leash, where they could easily prevent any and all expansion plans they didn't like and approve of. So like an MGM type of deal. He'd have to get approval. CBS kind of takeover. He'd have to get approval. Buying a film library. He'd have to get approval. And that comes with a lot of conflicts of interest when you have executives from Time Inc., HBO, those are the things they want control of. So basically, they're kind of saying, Ted, you're going to have to do this with one hand behind your back if you want to stay in your own company, right? The devil's in the details, guys. But hey, with their rescue package, Ted maintained control of Turner Broadcasting with 51% of TBS's equity and more than 67.8% of the voting control. But now, Ted couldn't go rogue and on a whim decide he wanted to buy NBC or create a competing entity. No, he needed their approval first. John Malone described the deal, quote, "We set out to raise about $550 million for 35% of TBS. I became the guy raising the money, and we came up with half of it ourselves, and then we went out to syndicate it. Early on, we thought we had Viacom, which was run at the time by Terry Elks, and we had the Cox guys, and we had the Time Mears guys, and that was our team. We deliberately wanted to keep it away from Time Inc. As much as we liked their CEO, Nick Nicholas, we knew they had great aspirations to control CNN, and we wanted people who would be supportive and passive, not ones who would try and take it over from an editorial point of view. That was Ted, too. He didn't really want to run the risk of losing editorial control of his baby. And so, that's how we set out to raise the money. Well, at the last minute, Viacom gets taken over by Sumner Redstone. Sumner's not interested in playing team ball, so he pulls out. So in order to replace Viacom, we ultimately have to turn to Time Inc. Then both Times Mirror and Cox say that if Time Inc. is in, we're out. So then we ended up having to put it together with just us and our affiliated companies and Time Inc. and with a series of other smaller cable operators, end quote. So yeah, those were the cable operators' terms. And for Ted, there wasn't much of a choice. It was either take the deal or lose his company. On June 3rd, 1987, it was official. Now, in my opinion, it was one hell of a deal for anyone, but even more so for Ted Turner, who'd been ruffling feathers since the early 70s. But remember, he'd also been cable before cable was cool, and now the industry he'd championed for years was returning the favor. I mean, it's pretty miraculous when you think about it. In any other era, it's hard to imagine Ted getting this kind of deal, but like so many other moments in his life, it was the right time, the right place, and the right people. Or so he thought. Ted explained the situation. Quote, "I like to think that Weird Brer Rabbit, when he got caught, he was hoping he'd get thrown right into that briar patch. Well, that's what happened to us. We got thrown right where we wanted to be. Sure, I've got negative covenants, but the negative covenants I have with the cable operators are not significantly different than they were with the banks. The banks being the junk bonds. Now, there's so much supposition and conjecture. It's great. We create more ink, even though we're not saying anything. And everyone says, well, he's finished this time, end quote. But they were wrong. He wasn't finished this time. That's not the Ted Turner story. Ultimately, the deal brought together more than 30 cable companies, including Malone's TCI, United Artists Communications, American Television and Communications, HBO, which was another subsidy of Time Inc. Also joining were Warner Cable Communications, Continental Cablevision, and United Cable Television. Together, they invested roughly $550 million for one-third of Turner Broadcasting, valuing TBS at approximately $1.5 billion. Trig Marin of Time Inc. insisted that if Ted ever stepped down, Time would get the right to operate CNN, while investors secured a right of first refusal if Ted ever sold his stake entirely. As a result, Time Inc. and TCI, the two biggest rivals in the cable industry at the time, entered into a mutual buy-sell agreement which effectively neutralized each other while keeping Ted in charge of his own company. In his memoir, Ted described the bailout not so much as a bailout, but as an investment by mutually beneficial partners. I guess that's a good way to put it. Quote, by June, the deal was in place and more than 30 cable companies invested a total of $565 million for 37% at Turner Broadcasting System, Inc. For a number of reasons, we felt like this was a good transaction for Turner shareholders. I still controlled a majority of the company's voting shares. We raised the capital we needed, and we had a dream team of industry partners invested in our company. As part of the deal, 7 of our 15 board seats went to our representatives of our larger cable investors, including TCI, Time Inc., and Continental Cablevision. I like the idea of having smart cable operators on our board, so much that I filled one of my 8 seats with Brian Roberts at Comcast. Comcast's investment wasn't large enough to earn a seat, but I wanted him and his company to be involved. While they didn't own a majority of our voting shares, our new investors did attach strings to the deal. For example, TBS could not make expenditures of more than $2 million without board approval. But with that first restriction came a second. Both Time Inc. and TCI each had the right to veto any of these activities. So for any meaningful strategic moves or acquisitions, we had to get the approval of both TCI and Time Inc. By the time we got to negotiating these finer points, not only did we not have a whole lot of leverage with our prospective investors, but both Bill Bevins, my vice president of finance, and I were exhausted. Between the planning for CBS, then negotiating to buy MGM, selling it back in pieces, and now this new arrangement, we were simply burned out. Bevins, in fact, had a mild heart attack in my office and wound up leaving the company shortly after this deal was finalized. Handing veto power over to Time and TCI would ultimately become one of my greatest regrets. I'd been working with the board of directors for many years, but these first meetings with this new group were an eye-opener. Not only had my authority been limited, I was now presiding over a board that included successful, strong-willed entrepreneurs who were also our biggest customers. It was a collegial group, but we all knew that there was some real competition and tension across their various companies. Recognizing that our arrangement was unusual, everyone worked hard to make sure we were acting in the best interest of our shareholders and trying to avoid conflicts of interest, end quote. But it's really hard to avoid conflicts of interest, right? Not when you want to launch something and then your board member does too, right? And so with the new capital in place, Ted paid off Kerkorian and still had enough money left to bid for NFL football rights in 1988 for his new network, TNT, which we'll talk about shortly. Bill Daniels, who helped organize the cable consortium, was glad he did. He even invested in TBS himself, becoming TBS's largest individual shareholder after Ted. Daniels explained, quote, "The cable industry is faced with what might be called the Turner dilemma. The only thing worse for the industry than having Ted Turner as the most important person in cable is not having Ted Turner as the most important person in cable," end quote. While Wall Street called it a bailout for Ted's overpaying on MGM, Broadcasting Magazine saw it differently. Quote, "That's step 1 in Turner's recovery plan. He's now in an incredibly strong position to take step 2, which is to use the leverage his new partners can provide to launch new programming," end quote. Which is exactly what Ted did. Now he was equipped with a higher valuation than ever, it's $1.5 billion, a massive film library, and new partners eager to see Turner Broadcasting grow, as long as he was more cautious, and it didn't mess with their cable plans. Still, at the end of the day, all that mattered was that Ted Turner was still in the game. And like they say in poker, if you've got a chip in a chair, you've still got a chance. And Ted, well, he had a lot more than just one chip. So, once the deal to inject $550 million into Turner Broadcasting was official on June 3rd, 1987, Ted Turner's wild roller coaster year-and-a-half journey of trying to take over CBS, navigating his disastrous purchase of MGM, and ultimately, somehow, finding a way to recover while still remaining in control of his own company, was finally over. For the first time in his entire career, Ted Turner had partners, real partners, with actual skin in the game. And of course, they held the trump card, real veto power, over any spending over $2 million. Now, Ted's new investors weren't particularly fond of his one-man band management style, but he still ran the company. And I'm sure you're wondering why. Well, it's part of that simple, the devil you know is better than the devil you don't, right? But also, Ted was now the one board member who posed no real threat to anyone else. They basically could control what he bought and what he couldn't buy. You know, he wants to buy a company. Can't do that, Ted. We're going to buy it. Or can't do that, Ted. It's not in our interests. The deal's restrictions really clipped his wings, making him much less dangerous to his new partners, as you'll soon see. For board members like John Malone, HBO's Michael Fuchs, and Time Inc.'s Jerry Levin, Ted and his channels weren't really threats anymore. They were opportunities. Historian H.W. Brands explained some of the complexity of the deal. Quote, needless to say, this arrangement severely constrained Turner's swashbuckling style. Jerry Hogan, who had been with Turner from the early days, asked retrospectively, quote, how could we at Turner live with those guys? How could they be our customers and yet be our shareholders? End quote. Relations at first proved difficult. Quote, the board was clearly operating with another agenda, Hogan said. Their agenda was, what's good for the cable industry? End quote. Yet it didn't take long for the two sides, the cable operators and Turner, to recognize the mutuality of substantial portions of their interests. Hogan explained later, quote, what's good for the cable industry has been good for Turner and vice versa, end quote. The numbers certainly suggested as much. By the end of 1989, the four networks of TBS claimed nearly one-third of all cable viewers. The company was worth more than $5 billion. CNN, the jewel in the Turner crown, was watched in 89 countries around the world and had an operating profit of $85 million, end quote. Now, convincing a committee to go along with his ideas had never been Ted's style. Remember, he hated committees. He said it all the way back in the early 70s, which I covered in the second episode. Add to that the fact that almost half of his board consisted of competitors, and you've got the conditions for a lot of interesting situations and outcomes, along with a lot of tension, right? Now, TBS's new board of directors wasn't some local Rotary Club type of board. No, it was a major media company board made up of execs from Time Inc., TCI, and more. You know, big egos, masters of the media universe, changing the world, all of it. But when Ted spoke to Broadcasting Magazine about how things at TBS would work moving forward, he seemed pretty open-minded. Quote, I believe that in order to solve the problems of today, we have to work together. We've got to strengthen the United Nations. We're going to have to learn to get along with everybody, and that's a big difference. That's a major change. And in order for me to be able to espouse that philosophy and promulgate it, I have to have partners of my own and learn how to get along with them. Broadcasting then asked, does that mean you have to be quieter? Ted laughed and said, well, yes. I mean, when you've got partners, you have to spend some time listening. You can't be talking all the time. Broadcasting then asked if he knew he was in trouble after the MGM acquisition. Ted replied, I knew I was in trouble before I bought MGM. That's why I bought it. I maintain we were in much more trouble before we got into it. Broadcasting followed up, asking, how much trouble? Ted said, quote, we didn't have any proprietary programming for WTBS to speak of. We had the Braves and we had a little Jacques Cousteau programming and some documentaries we had done, but we were at the mercy of Hollywood, and I wanted to use our position to move to the next level, which was to own a library, and a fine library, so that we could control enough programming that we could program a really fine entertainment network, not only in the United States, but globally, to position ourselves in the global business. I felt like, and still feel like, that if you just have distribution today, and that's basically what the three networks have, you're very vulnerable, end quote. Turner Broadcasting executive Terry McGurk later said, quote, in hindsight, you could say that Ted lost his company, but at that time, it was in many ways nirvana, because Ted partnered with his best customers. Turner, however, wanted to expand, and he soon learned that his new partners did not. They wanted to protect Turner's programming assets for the cable industry and keep them away from broadcast rivals. Or they wanted the assets for themselves. Turner had staved off one Fox only to allow others inside, end quote. Ted pushed back on the whole bailout narrative, saying, quote, people assumed it was a bailout. I've seen it a dozen times, but I never said that. There were several other entities sitting there willing to do the same thing, maybe even on more favorable terms. We were not desperate in any way like CBS was with its massive layoffs in the news department and huge buyback of its own stock. We may have looked like we were in financial trouble, but you didn't hear any crying on the part of anybody at Turner Broadcasting. We had oodles of alternatives, and we picked the one that made the most strategic sense for us, end quote. Sure, Ted. But all those alternatives weren't viable if Ted wanted to stay in control of his own company. He had to stay in control of his own company, and only the cable operators wanted that. Otherwise, he would have been out of there. Ted got the Godfather deal, even if it meant he'd have to run the company with one hand tied behind his back. Now, with all these elements, big egos, new constraints, clashing agendas, and a plethora of conflicts of interest, Turner Broadcasting was entering a new era in 1987. Almost immediately, reports surfaced that John Malone was really pushing Ted to abandon his one-man band approach to running TBS. Everyone involved admitted that those early board meetings were long, tense, and filled with a lot of friction between Ted and his new cable friends. Ted even admitted, quote, my power is somewhat diminished, end quote. In the 2001 Cindio Institute conversation I keep mentioning, TBS board members Trig Marin and John Malone reflected on their early TBS board meetings. Marin said, quote,
I remember those board meetings, the Turner board meetings, as being some of the more rollicking board meetings.
Well, they were very interesting. They were very interesting. But, you know, look, Ted doesn't fool anybody with his country, boy. He's a very sharp guy.
Yeah,
and,
he sure is.
And he does keep his eye on the ball long term.
Yep.
So he may not be able to keep his hands off the ladies, but he can keep his eye on the ball from a business point of view. So that all worked out great, and it's just one of those multiple industry efforts that we've undertaken over the years that I think makes you feel really good about the cable industry. Yep. You know, everybody rallied around and helped Ted keep control of his company.
Yeah, and I think more than that, it's interesting as I reflect on what we did at that period. It wasn't just to help Ted keep control, which was very important, I think, to all of us, but we actually saved an institution.
Yes.
That is extraordinarily important to U.S. news and information, and didn't let it get into irresponsible hands.
Yeah, one of two things could have happened. It could have gotten into irresponsible hands, or it could have gotten so buried in debt that it couldn't have done its job.
Absolutely.
Couldn't have provided a quality product, and either one of those would have been very harmful to the industry. So it really all worked out very nicely.
Now, it's important for me to note that in 1987, all Ted really had was programming. He had his 3 channels, CBS, CNN, and Headline News, and then the Atlanta Braves and Hawks, and of course MGM's massive film library, which we talked about in the last episode. He never really thought he'd need more than that, until now. Remember, I discussed in the last episode how this is starting to become an era of massive media growth, where the big were getting bigger, and the small were getting swallowed. Ted knew he had to keep growing, but how? How could he expand with a new board of directors made up mostly of his competitors who also want to keep growing and can also veto any deal over $2 million? So how can he do that? Remember, programming had always been the cornerstone of Ted's empire, and as he acquired more content, his growth always followed. By 1987, Ted owned more film and TV programming than anyone else in the world. His library wasn't just a competitive advantage, it was everything. It gave him something no other network had: independence. He didn't need Hollywood anymore, at least not in the immediate future, and that content could power new cable networks, assuming his new partners would let him. Now, that's all already existing content. If he wants to make original content, he has to buy a studio, but he can't buy a studio because of the $2 million deal. Meanwhile, at the same time, CNN was taking off, with its popularity about to skyrocket thanks to a wave of historical news events, which we'll get to later this episode. Still, it's not surprising that almost immediately after the deal closed, Ted started frustrating his new cable partners. For the first time, people were watching how he spent money. And for those investors, it kind of felt like financial babysitting. You know, they're all a grown group of very successful media executives, right? And now they're kind of arguing over Ted's allowance. So, of course, Ted decided to test those limits and their patience. I guess he figured, why not try to see how far he could flex his spending muscles and see what happens, right? Let's see if they'll actually veto what I want to do. Take new board member Michael Fuchs, then the CEO of HBO. And from my research, not necessarily Ted's biggest fan. Fuchs told Ted he couldn't, quote, take millions of this company's dollars and squander them away on an ideology that's out there in the wild somewhere, end quote. Still, early on, things seemed fine. For example, when Ted wanted to buy 750 RKO films that weren't part of the original MGM deal, he asked the board to approve $30 million, which they quickly did because it made sense. Sure, $30 million was a lot of money in 1987, but the cable investors wanted Turner Broadcasting to grow, just as long as it didn't interfere with their own expansion plans. They don't need that content. And so programming deals like this were easy for them to approve. It only makes Turner's channels stronger, right? I'm sure they figured, why not, you know? Okay, we'll give him the little wins, but if he wants to buy a network, no chance that's what you got. Broadcasting Magazine's Don West said, quote, these are smart guys. They wouldn't have made this kind of investment in Turner if they didn't think he could pull it off in the long run, end quote. And they weren't the only ones who wanted part of or all of Turner Broadcasting, because in late 1987, General Electric's Jack Welch and Bob Wright, who was running NBC at the time, started looking for what Welch called, quote, one big bang. My job in this area is to keep asking them, how are you going to deal with network erosion, end quote. NBC CEO Bob Wright had a big bang deal in mind, buying all or part of Turner Broadcasting, including CNN. And this is the kind of deal that makes a lot of sense for the network, right? Now, Wright, who previously had run Cox Cable before joining NBC, saw this as a great opportunity for NBC to expand into cable and for Turner Broadcasting to gain more resources like stronger ad sales, more scale, and another injection of capital. So they kind of wanted to superpower Turner Broadcasting, right? Of course, Ted had made a similar pitch years ago to NBC, but that fell on deaf ears. But when NBC realized it couldn't buy all of Turner Broadcasting, Wright shifted gears, pitching what GE called an alliance, where they'd buy 25% of Turner while partnering with Time Inc., TCI, and Turner. Ted wanted NBC to pay $20 per share, which was about $400 million for 20% of the company, while Wright offered $12 per share, roughly $250 million. But Wright also wanted more influence in Turner Broadcasting, and that includes CNN, while Ted, of course, wanted him to have less. And then Time Inc. didn't want NBC involved at all. You know, even though NBC had new owners, it was still a broadcast network. And to the cable guys, that meant they were the enemy. They didn't want anything to do with the networks. They were ascendant, not the networks, right? Why help them out? Ultimately, the valuation gap was too big to make a deal work. But that wasn't the only issue. You see, Ted's cable partners had their own motives. Continental Cablevision President Timothy Neer told the Los Angeles Times that an NBC deal, quote, would bring in new money and we're all in favor of that. The question is, what kind of role would they want in programming? We want the company to continue to put on strong, exclusive programming, end quote. Basically, Neer was saying, NBC, get off our cable lawn. We like who's running programming, and that's Ted Turner. And he wasn't alone. Other board members had their own agendas. Michael Fuchs of HBO wanted to enter live news themselves and saw potential in partnering with CNN. John Malone's TCI wanted to keep Ted under friendly control to ensure affordable programming for his cable systems at TCI. And then you had Time Inc. and TCI, who were both determined to keep CNN out of the hands of any broadcast rival like NBC for the time being. At the same time, Ted was fighting to stay in control, working hard to keep his partners divided and holding as little power over him as possible, even though they could veto any purchase or acquisition over $2 million. Michael Fuchs later joked, quote, sometimes it's better to have 3 bosses than 1 boss, end quote. So by mid-January 1988, the NBC deal was dead. Jack Welch and Bob Wright would have to wait a lot longer for their big bang deal. Now, in Three Blind Mice, Ken Auletta explained how the network's dominance was already collapsing. They don't ever go away. They're huge right now. I mean, relative, but then Netflix is like gigantic. In 1976, the big three had 92% of the primetime audience. By 1988, that number had dropped to 68%. Meanwhile, the average home had gone from 22 channels to 28, 4 times more than in 1976. Cable now reached over half of all Americans, compared to just 15% a decade earlier. And I'll sing it again. The times they were a-changin'. So you can't blame a forward thinker like Jack Welch for wanting a piece of cable's future. But you also can't blame Ted's board for blocking NBC and GE from even getting close. It wasn't at all in their interest because they know cable is ascendant. Why let the networks in on the party, right? They've spent a lot of money investing in Turner Broadcasting and in cable in general. They're not going to let the networks get a free ride on this one because despite the constant bickering among Ted's cable partners, whenever an outside threat appeared, the cable industry always closed ranks. This was no different. Still, it's worth remembering, even though Ted's partners had the power to rein in his legendary spur-of-the-moment M&A decisions, they also had the ability to create magic together. And by that I mean they could use their cable systems to grow new channels faster and bigger than ever before, where 1 + 1 = 10. John Malone controls 1 out of every 4 cable boxes in the entire country at this point. So yeah, and a great example of this is the creation of Turner Network Television, which you probably know as TNT in 1988. Now, remember, Ted loves ideas. He loved them so much he once said, quote, "I intend to conquer the world, but instead of conquering with bombs, I intend to conquer with good ideas," end quote. And now, with fresh capital, Ted was ready to build again. With the CBS and MGM deals in the rearview mirror, he could finally focus on growing Turner Broadcasting. So, almost immediately after his bailout, he set out to launch his new big programming venture, and he wanted to waste no time leveraging his new MGM film library to create this new channel. It was the perfect setup, really. With cable operators as partners, it was easier for him to launch new channels than ever before. You remember with CNN, he had to go to cable operators and ask them to carry the channel, and almost every one of them said no. Now, it's in both their interests. So this new channel would become Turner Network Television, and the plan was originally set in motion at the very first meeting of the newly restructured Turner Broadcasting Board. Details? You got it. About 75% of TNT's programming would come straight from MGM's library, and unlike the 100% ad-supported Superstation, TNT would have 2 revenue streams, advertising and subscription fees from cable providers, who would pay for the right to air TNT. Now, with new partners who had both the means and motivation to carry all of his channels, Ted finally saw his moment and decided to go all in. TNT wouldn't just be another version of the Superstation. It would be bigger, better, and premium. CNN had gone on the air in 1980 with about 2 million subscribers, but cable penetration had grown dramatically since then. Ted described his pitch to the board for TNT, quote, "At our first board meeting, I pushed hard for us to develop a new entertainment channel. My idea was to compete directly with the networks with original programming. And while the Superstation relied primarily on reruns and sports, this channel would make original movies and pursue big, high-profile events."
The power of positive programming. From the people who brought you CNN, Headline News, and Superstation TBS. Classic movies, original programming, special events. Turner Network Television. TNT. Coming this fall, only on cable.
Our management team, led by Jerry Hogan, put together a list of the top 100 events on television, everything from the NFL to the Olympics, the Oscars, the Emmys, Miss America, and Wimbledon. This collection became our shopping list, and we used it in sales pitches to advertisers and cable operators to give them an idea of how ambitious we plan to be. Filling out the schedule would be movies, series, and cartoons drawn primarily from our library. Because we would target the networks directly, when deciding on what to call the channel, I felt we should use the word network and came up with Turner Network Television, or TNT. We planned for this channel to be dynamite. Advertising revenue alone would not be enough to finance such an ambitious channel. We needed subscription fees as well, and we targeted 15 cents per month. While 15 cents might not seem like much, when you multiply that by 12 months and spread it across millions of subscribers, the numbers get big pretty quickly. And these revenues would provide a strong, steady foundation for our continued investments in original, high-quality programming. CNN had gone on the air in 1980 with about 2 million subscribers, but cable penetration had grown dramatically since then. And with operator owners in agreement with our plan, it looked like we would launch TNT with much wider distribution. In addition to high-profile events and original programming, I envisioned TNT as a vehicle to maximize the value of our newly purchased libraries, end quote. In 2013, Ted told Variety, quote, I figured I had the cable industry's goodwill behind me for all the other things I'd done, so they would go ahead and cough up the 15 cents a month. He added, it was hard to get them to part with money. Cable operators weren't used to paying for programming. To the best of my recollection, Malone was begrudgingly supportive, and once he did a deal, everybody did, end quote. Ahead of TNT's launch, Ted told his team they'd broadcast films from his newly acquired MGM library, as well as major events, quote, things like the Rose Bowl Parade and the Kentucky Derby, the Indianapolis 500, and the Olympics. Then he added, and yeah, the Academy Awards, let's get that too, end quote. Amazingly, Ted didn't know the Oscars were already contracted to ABC. I guess when you're moving that fast, right? Now, right before TNT launched, Ted learned that even though he owned the entire MGM library, he didn't actually have the TV rights to air some of his biggest movies, including two of his biggest, Gone with the Wind and The Wizard of Oz, which CBS had locked up for the next 20 years. Not ideal, right? Not when those are two of the biggest movies throughout our childhoods on TNT and TBS. And yeah, I'd be frustrated too if I were Ted. You know, you own this, but guess what? CBS has the rights to it right now. CBS broadcast president Gene Jankowski said, quote, when Turner discovered that CBS owned the rights to air Gone with the Wind, I think he was shocked. He came to us and began to negotiate to get the films back. As it happened, we had already made back what we had spent on Gone with the Wind in just the first few telecasts. So CBS television president Bud Grant did the deal that gave Ted Turner back the movies he was determined to own outright. Of course, it cost him several more million, end quote.
Hello, and welcome to TNT. We at Turner Broadcasting are proud of and excited about today's launch of television's newest programming service, Turner Network Television. TNT is aimed at bringing you a lineup of high-quality, high-profile programming built on a firm foundation of classic movies, exclusive programs, and special events. So while we're starting with one special event each month during our first year, by 1992, our goal is to feature more than 200 nights a year of original television movies, miniseries, sports, and specials. It's an ambitious plan, and with the backing of our partners in the cable industry, it's one that we're fully committed to. Our promise to you is to provide viewing choices aimed at the highest common denominator, programming that will inform, educate, inspire, enlighten, and entertain. Thank you for joining us to begin this new adventure together. And now, just as we launched another pioneer, Cable News Network, over 8 years ago.
In Call Me Ted, Ted described TNT's launch an incredible early success. Quote, TNT debuted on October 3rd, 1988. We signed on with my favorite movie, Gone with the Wind, and our signal reached an amazing 17 million households, making TNT's launch by far the largest in cable history. We didn't charge a subscription fee for the first 3 months, but in January of 1989, we began collecting a monthly fee of 15 cents per household. By spring, we were up to 24 million households, and by TNT's first anniversary, it was carried in 50 million homes and generated nearly $100 million in subscriber revenue alone. It would be a while before we landed any of the targets on our top 100 list, but we did produce some great original movies, a first for basic cable, and viewers and advertisers responded well to the channel. TNT would eventually become home to telecasts of the NFL, the NBA, Wimbledon, PGA Golf, and other major events, and today it remains one of television's most valuable channels. While TNT was a major success due in large part to cooperation from our cable operator partners, they did stop me from pursuing another cable channel that I really wanted, end quote. And I'll talk about that one in a minute. In the same Variety interview, Ted said, quote, "It was a success from the day it launched. We launched with Gone with the Wind. That set a high standard. I figured if everything we did was as good as Gone with the Wind, we'd be okay," end quote. So while Ted had initially projected around 7 million subscribers at launch, the combination of TNT's strong programming, along with the backing from his cable partners, TNT reached an incredible 17 million subscribers. It made their debut the most successful launch of a new channel in TV history at the time. That's how important distribution was. In a way, just like Ted had created a similar but different version of CNN with headline news, he'd done the same with TNT, which was a newer, fresher, and more premium version of the Superstation, and it also had subscriber fees from the cable bundle. Ted said, quote, "That's the problem with CBS, NBC, and ABC. They've only got one channel each in a 50-channel environment. I have 4. End quote. And more were on the way. Longtime Turner Broadcasting exec and TNT president Jerry Hogan added, quote, "We'll have to crawl before we walk," end quote. So during TNT's first year, they aired just one major event each month. The rest of the schedule was full of reruns of shows like The Muppets and movies from that MGM library. Still, with its premium programming and MGM's vast library, TNT was able to quickly position itself as a real, serious alternative to the big three broadcast networks and Rupert Murdoch's new Fox network. Within just a few years, TNT was investing over $150 million a year in new programming. A lot of that was sports, right? Nearly double what any other cable channel was spending on new programming. But that level of spending also made sense for them. You see, as the quality of TNT's programming improved and ratings grew, Ted knew he could also raise those subscriber carriage fees that he charged the cable operators to carry his channel. After all, viewers clearly loved what TNT had to offer, and the more they loved it, the more cable operators needed it, right? So Ted raised the carriage fees, and he would raise them and raise them and raise them, and the cable operators had to have TNT, right? So it started at 15 cents and only kept on growing. In a way, TNT was kind of like HBO before HBO started making original shows like Oz, The Sopranos, The Wire, Sex and the City. But TNT had ads. Remember, this is a decade or so before HBO truly evolved into the version of HBO that we know, where those shows started debuting in the late 1990s. TNT executive Scott Sassa explained how TNT's launch revealed cable's untapped potential. Quote, "You've still got that 27 million household disparity between the number of homes that can now receive cable and those that actually do. That's $54 billion of untapped assets the cable industry has out there," end quote. Ted added, quote, "The fat days of the big three are over," end quote. And he was right. TNT blew past every projection he had made. Yet despite TNT's huge success, Ted still felt pressure from his cable partners, who argued that TNT's historic debut was more from their backing, their distribution, than his savvy leadership and programming. You know, sure, he got on more households earlier because of them, but also he's the one investing a lot of money into the programming, and it's his vision. Distribution is very important, and they had a good point, though. After all, their support had helped, and not marginally. By the end of TNT's first year, TNT hit 35 million subscribers, and Turner Broadcasting stock had gone from $8 a share after the 1987 crash to a high of $58 a share by late 1989, just a year after TNT's debut. At the same time, the restrictive covenants from MGM's junk bonds kept Ted from paying cash dividends to his new partners. That forced him to issue stock instead and risk losing control to Time Inc. and TCI. But new financing soon allowed Ted to restructure $1.6 billion in debt, swapping junk bonds for lower interest loans, stabilizing Turner Broadcasting's credit, and securing its future. Merrill Lynch, which underwrote $200 million of the new debt, said, quote, "Turner Broadcasting has a great 1-2 combination. It combines the top creative programming team and the most financially astute operators in the cable TV industry. That is quite a powerful alliance," end quote. In fact, by this point, Ted was using MGM's film library so effectively across his networks that MGM's own minority shareholders later sued the studio's directors, claiming they'd sold the assets too cheaply, which is pretty incredible when you consider Ted's predicament, right? And when you combine that with TNT's record-breaking launch, Ted felt vindicated, saying, quote, "I may make a mistake someday, but buying MGM wasn't one of them," end quote. Remember, since buying MGM, Ted's mentality was simple. Quote, "We've got 35% of all the great films of all time. We've got Spencer Tracy and Jimmy Cagney working for us from the grave," end quote. And that belief continued every time he turned on TNT or the Superstation or later TCM, Turner Classic Movies, and Cartoon Network, and saw Hollywood legends of yesteryear working their magic from the stars. Now, what made TNT's launch even more impressive was that it was built on the supposed financial disaster that was the MGM deal. You see, Ted didn't just use the library for TNT. He was also syndicating a lot of those movies for TV abroad in Europe. Eventually, even Wall Street came around, with some analysts even wondering if the $1.2 billion net price Ted paid for MGM wasn't outrageous at all. Maybe it was even a bargain. Crazy how that works, right? I mean, that entire library now is with Warner Discovery. It's worth a lot of money, right? Later in 1990, Institutional Investor even named it one of the deals of the decade, which, when you think about all things considered, is pretty damn amazing. Still, it wasn't just the money Ted paid for MGM that mattered. It was the price he paid in control. By letting cable operators into his company, he effectively handcuffed his future, even if he didn't have much of a choice. Sure, he could have sold the company, but he wouldn't be able to stay in control, right? But remember, owning as much programming as possible had always been the Turner philosophy, and now he owned more content than anyone else in media. Still, Ted couldn't resist taking a jab at his new board member, HBO's Michael Fuchs, for not doing the same when he licensed movies from Hollywood studios for HBO, saying, quote, "They must feel like bozos. Time Inc. sat there with HBO paying out $500 million, $600 million a year for 10 years of programming. They spent $6 billion, and they licensed that programming from the producers and owned almost no negatives. I showed everyone," end quote. With his powerful cable partners behind him, Ted could count on their support, or at least he thought he could. Sure, disagreements and conflicts of interest were going to happen. They're inevitable. But Turner Broadcasting was once again a money-making powerhouse. And with the biggest names in cable on his board, Ted's influence and credibility only grew. He said, quote, "If we hadn't been undercapitalized, we could have grown a lot faster," end quote. Sure. But if my aunt had wheels, she'd be a bike. Ted, he has a good way of sugarcoating a lot of this stuff. Still, his hypothetical what-if world where he didn't need partners was just that. A fantasy, If he hadn't been undercapitalized, he wouldn't have brought in such a powerful group of investors. And honestly, it's really hard to imagine him surviving the MGM deal as CEO, chairman, and the majority owner without these cable investors, right? And the fact that they let him run the company and keep majority ownership, that is something to be thankful for. Finally, to close the loop on MGM and the TNT story, with MGM's library now proving more valuable than anyone ever expected, Ted also became one of Michael Milken's biggest success stories. Like many who'd worked with Milken, he stayed fiercely loyal, even after Milken's indictment. At the last Predators Ball in 1988, Ted said, quote, "If this guy ever goes to jail, then I want to be right there in the cell next to him," end quote. Now that's loyalty. Now, a lot of this season has probably felt like a roller coaster. One where Ted Turner hits all the peaks and valleys and somehow at the end of the ride manages to stay on track and avoid total disaster, right? But here's one thing that didn't go according to his plan. When Ted bought the MGM film library, he had these grand visions of taking this huge catalog of black and white films and getting them colorized. Now, colorization was in a way kind of like the fight over generative AI today, which is a clash between art and commerce. You see, Ted's idea, though, was to literally take the black and white world of the movies he now owned and bring them to life in color. Kind of like when Dorothy leaves Kansas, opens the door, and it's like a black and white world after that tornado, and enters Oz and it's color, right? Now, it's interesting, when they filmed that movie, they actually painted the entire house sepia, so it would look like a black and white world. And even the actress, I think it was a double, woke up and she's not wearing the Dorothy blue dress. She's wearing a sepia dress. But no one in the audience knows that because they're used to a world in 1939 in black and white. Then they open the door and it's color. Well, Ted wants to do that to every movie in the MGM catalog, because a lot of them are black and white. Now, that doesn't sound so wild today, but we've also had decades of Photoshop, CGI, Pixar, Jurassic Park, generative AI, all of which have reshaped what we even call art. But even in the 80s, colorization was radical. To many film enthusiasts, it would be like painting over a Picasso or a Rembrandt with spray paint, you know? Now, years before buying MGM, Ted described learning about colorization, saying, quote, I had met with a couple of entrepreneurs who were seeking investors. These two had developed a technology called colorization that could add color to old black and white films and television shows. I thought it was a great idea. By this time, everyone had color TVs, and programming in color was simply better. I passed on investing at that time, explaining that while we ran a lot of black and white programming, we didn't own any of it. Instead, I suggested they speak to people at MGM and the other studios with old libraries. But I followed their progress in the trades in subsequent months and figured that if we ever controlled a library like MGM's, we could create value by colorizing the old black and white movies. End quote. While most studio heads and network executives were focused on the short term, their movies coming up that quarter, and just keeping their jobs, Ted was thinking long term, and he saw an opportunity they didn't. He wanted to take a dusty old library, all black and white, and increase its value using color to make old black and white movies feel new again. But like I've said in earlier episodes, Hollywood doesn't love new technology, does it? And from Ted's point of view as an owner-operator who believed in maximizing every asset and creating something new from something old, it made perfect sense. He explained, quote, one of my fundamental beliefs about running a business, when you own an asset, your job is to maximize its value. For Turner Broadcasting, that might mean using unsold billboards to promote our radio stations, airing the Braves on the Superstation, or disappointing some film purists by updating old movies. Our competitors had more resources than we did, and we had to do everything we could to get the most out of what we had. While colorization wasn't accepted in certain circles, TV audiences responded well. We had run Miracle on 34th Street on the Superstation at Christmas time for years, and when we first showed the colorized version, it did nearly 6 times its average rating. And when we added color to Santa's outfit, we had a high degree of confidence that we were getting it right. End quote. So, while colorization wasn't cheap, the results spoke for themselves. Ted added, quote, we continued to invest in the preservation and colorization of our older films. In fact, the first step in the colorization process is restoring the original print to the best state possible. Colorizing movies was not inexpensive. It cost about $2,000 per minute, or about $200,000 for the average length film. But updating these older titles helped us earn new syndication revenues, especially overseas where many television stations had stopped buying black and white product. It also gave us the opportunity to premiere these newly colorized classics on TBS and TNT, end quote. You see, Ted estimated that by investing 50% more into these films, they could double their value, and for some of the movies, it did much more. Colorization turned out to be a huge win for Turner Broadcasting as it boosted the value of black and white classics like It's a Wonderful Life and Miracle on 34th Street as much as tenfold. Even Gone with the Wind benefited as the colorization process restored the movie's original hues, which had faded over time. Ted said in the mid-1980s, quote, the first 6 months after we colorized the film, we more than pay for it, end quote. So by the end of 1987, Turner had colorized 18 films, and even though he planned to air some only in color, he defended the process by pointing out that the original black and white prints and negatives would always remain intact. I mean, they were improving the print, too. So even if they were going to colorize it, they were making the black and white versions look much better. It's film, it's physical, it looks worse over time. But not everyone loved colorization. In fact, outside of Ted and Wall Street, nobody liked it, especially Hollywood. To them, Ted was messing with cinema history. He might as well have been putting lipstick on a masterpiece, kind of like Jack Nicholson's Joker does in the museum scene in Batman. And as Hollywood is known to do, it fought back hard against Ted's efforts to colorize MGM's classics. On Larry King Live on CNN, which was Ted's own network, movie icons Jimmy Stewart and Burt Lancaster ripped into Ted's pathetic logic, their words, for tampering with cinema perfection. Watching from Atlanta, Ted later told Larry King that he was devastated since, quote, those guys are 2 of my favorite actors, Larry. end quote. From there, the whole thing kind of exploded. MGM executives responsible for managing the film library ended up on the Today Show and Good Morning America, forced to defend the studio and really just Ted Turner's position. Then the controversy snowballed all the way to Congress, where Ted's team had to defend colorization on a national stage. A New York congressman even proposed federal legislation to prohibit the, quote, destruction of America's cinema masterpieces, end quote. Even some of Hollywood's biggest directors, like Steven Spielberg, Martin Scorsese, and others, showed up in D.C. to testify against Ted's colorization of these Hollywood classics. Ted said, quote, "It was more controversial than I had anticipated, and when we announced our colorization plans, there was backlash from the Hollywood community. Some directors and producers, everyone from Martin Scorsese to Billy Wilder, were outraged that we would colorize classic films without input from their original creators, who were mostly deceased. We were accused of cultural vandalism. Woody Allen said that what we were doing was criminal and showed, quote, a total contempt for film, for the director, and for the public, end quote. And yet, Ted was undeterred. You see, he didn't think he was destroying anything, nor was he doing anything wrong. To him, he was simply breathing new life into these old movies and attracting, quote, audiences that wouldn't have seen them otherwise, end quote. Think about it. Movies have been edited or changed for TV for decades, and that's what he's doing, with their dimensions being altered, language censored, and even runtime shortened to fit the channel schedule. So what made this so different, right? Well, that's the logical way, but in this way, they were changing how the movies looked. And I can imagine Ted asking all those questions, right? And they're all fair. He owns the product, too. Now, to me as a media operator, Ted's point of view makes complete sense. But as a cinephile and movie lover, I also understand where Martin Scorsese, Billy Wilder, and Orson Welles were coming from. To them, Ted was messing with their art, their history, When Ted said one of the first films he'd colorize would be one of his favorites, Citizen Kane, Orson Welles actually shot back from the grave, literally. You see, right before Welles' death in 1985,
one of Welles' last wishes, it said, was, please do not let Mr. Ted Turner put his coloring crayons to my greatest creation. Well, Mr. Turner decided that he would like to do that. Mr. Turner actually got the process underway. He had second thoughts. He had his attorneys look back at Welles' original contract, and there was a phrase in there, Welles shall deliver a black and white motion picture of a certain duration. They had second thoughts, so only the final reel of Kane was colorized and went to the vaults and was never seen.
I love it. But not every classic got that protection. Watching a colorized version of Casablanca, Ted bragged, quote, I knew it would be great. I just knew it. I'm no dodo. I already knew about colorization when I bought the library. I knew it would make these movies worth 10 times as much. Doesn't this just blow your mind? You never know that wasn't shot yesterday. The whole thing about colorization destroying films is just stupid. Women put on makeup every day and no one bitches about that, end quote. In the end, even though Hollywood hated it, colorization turned into another Turner win. As the founder and owner, Ted had the actual ability to take the heat from Hollywood. He didn't have to bow to their pressure, and it's clear that most other executives would have. And instead, he leveraged those films better than anyone else ever would have, turning them into a steady supply of programming for his stations. And just a short time later, those same movies, both the colorized and the black and white versions, would help launch TCM, which you know as Turner Classic Movies, in 1994. Now, time has a way of healing most wounds, but it also loves irony. I say that because the same MGM executive who oversaw colorization for Ted later won an honorary Oscar in 2005 for preserving film history. Of course, the Academy Award was presented by Martin Scorsese himself. Incredible. And fitting, because remember, the first step in colorization was always restoring the original print to its best possible state. Now, clearly this is not Ted's biggest battle. It's just a fun story to tell because History doesn't repeat itself, but it does seem to rhyme. And every media mogul tends to face moments like this. Some bow to industry pressure, but Ted Turner didn't. He took the punches and kept moving forward, trusting that time would take care of the rest. But another challenge was brewing within Turner's own board, a board that now included a number of his biggest rivals, right? Tension seemed to rise and fall with Ted's ambitions to expand into new programming arenas, which created a constant pressure cooker atmosphere. Is Ted going to do this? Do we have to tell him no? We need to tell him no. We have a veto. Do you have a veto? Exactly. For example, take the independent cable channel Financial News Network, or FNN, which by 1988 was headed towards bankruptcy. FNN was a 24-hour business news channel that had struggled to find a big enough audience on its own. But if it were paired with CNN and headline news, well, it would have been a perfect fit. And that's why Ted wanted it. You know, it was kind of a CNBC before CNBC even existed. But FNN was about to face its own serious new competition from NBC, which was preparing to launch its own business network, CNBC. Ted explained, quote, "Word got out that FNN could be purchased for as little as $100 million, and I wanted it badly. We already carried business news on CNN, and expanding that coverage on a 24-hour channel would be easy. The cost efficiencies of such an acquisition were compelling, and I thought if we moved quickly to purchase FNN and strengthen the channel, CNBC would be dead on arrival," end quote. So on March 23rd, 1989, Ted brought the proposal to buy FNN for a little more than $100 million to his board. And the board signaled that they were going to veto it. In CNN co-founder Reese Schonfeld's memoir, he explained that the board's decision wasn't because FNN was a bad investment, but because of conflicts of interest on Ted's board. Now, Reese explained that for CNBC to reach enough homes at launch in order to make it, they need that carriage. NBC had acquired a struggling 10 million home PR network from TCI, so they bought a network that was already in homes, but no one was really watching it. It was in 10 million homes, actually. And it was believed TCI had promised NBC they wouldn't launch a competing business channel. Now, with TCI and John Malone as major stakeholders in Turner Broadcasting, this created a clear conflict, right? Because if TBS bought FNN, it would obviously compete directly with CNBC, which for John Malone and TCI would be a total non-starter. They want CNBC to succeed, right? Still, for something Ted wanted this badly, what's surprising is that after hearing from enough board members that this wasn't going to fly, Ted's FNN proposal didn't even make it to a formal vote. He didn't even bring it up, as he knew it was dead on arrival. He later expressed disappointment, quote, "For the first time since investing in Turner, they kept me from making a deal I really wanted to make. While they raised questions about the viability of the concept of 24-hour business news and had concerns about the fact that NBC was planning a competitor, I think they worried that I was trying to do too much. This troubled them, not only because it might cause us to become stretched too thin, but also because we were growing too powerful. I was very disappointed. NBC wound up purchasing FNN," end quote. Michael Fuchs, of HBO, said, quote, "Ted is impulsive. Ted only had one speed, full speed ahead, but the board slows decisions down at the right times. It lends a balance. That is the reason Turner Broadcasting is in such terrific shape today," end quote. In Janet Lowe's Ted Turner Speaks, she quotes Emory professor Jeffrey Sonnenfeld, who said, quote, "Ted mentioned to me once that when he first met Michael Fuchs, he thought Fuchs had a poison tip at the end of his umbrella," end quote. And that's a board member on Turner's board. Now, poison tips kill quickly, but Ted's situation with his board was more like a frog in a gradually heating pot. It was never one cut that killed him. It's death by 1,000 cuts, where the heat just keeps on getting turned up, and Ted doesn't notice until potentially it's too late. These are things he has to make do with. These are guys who saved his ass, right? And in return, board members like Jerry Levin and Michael Fuchs, they have to think about their own companies first, HBO and Time Inc. at the time. We'll talk about Time Warner in a bit. So if Ted's plan to buy FNN threatened their businesses or their future deals, why would they let him move forward with it, right? No, they're there to protect their own businesses as well. Now, it's kind of hard not to empathize with Ted here. I mean, here's a guy who for nearly 2 decades had built Turner Broadcasting from nothing by betting it all of his own money, over and over again. And every time he did it, he didn't have to ask for anyone's approval. And now He's got a committee. And the committee all have their own agendas, right? And it's not just a committee with agendas. It's a committee full of sharks. And they're also his competitors. Still, Ted being Ted, eternal optimist, never accepts defeat, did his best to brush it off. But deep down, he probably believed that eventually he'd win them all over and regain control of his board so that he can make these moves, get a network eventually, buy the types of companies like FNN, right? He probably thought that. Whether it was through success of Turner Broadcasting, more revenue, more profits, okay, we'll buy them off. But why would they want to be bought off, right? They're already in the house. Or would it be his powers of persuasion? They'd always worked, right? Why not now? And despite the frustrations, Ted always stayed upbeat, saying, quote, I knew a lot of my partners pretty well before we came together. We may be moving a little bit slowly, but I'll guarantee you, we're not going to make any major mistakes, end quote. Now, the media and entertainment world changed forever on March 4th, 1989, when Time Inc. and Warner Communications announced plans to merge into a new mega conglomerate called Time Warner in a stock swap. No junk bonds, none of that stuff. They're just exchanging shares. At least that was the plan. To say this was a big deal would be a massive understatement. It was game-changing, seismic. It's the kind of thing that everyone looks at the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal and says, what are we doing? We can't sit on our asses anymore. Do we need to buy a competitor? Do we need to get bigger? We have to get bigger. We must get bigger. And I hate to tease another media mega merger, but I'm going to get into all the mechanics of this deal, the Time Warner deal, in another episode of Media Moguls when we talk about Steve Ross or Jerry Levin. But for now, it's important to talk about and understand how the deal unfolded in 1989. So we're going to keep it rather quick and simple compared to the 4-hour deep dive into the mechanics of Time and Warner. When the deal was first announced in March 1989, it was a stock-for-stock merger. Not exactly a merger of equals, but close enough for the sake of this summary. Now, despite being a merger of equals, Time Inc. was really buying Warner's in the stock swap. But when it came to their corporate cultures, people and norms and the things that tend to be ignored with these kind of mega mergers over and over, especially in media, it definitely wasn't viewed as a merger of equals. You see, Time and Warner Communications couldn't have been any more different. It was like oil and water. And it seems like this is always forgotten when it comes to these mega mergers between two media companies, because every company has its own culture and type of person that they hire. Some are guys with spikes and others are more safe, right? We'll see this again with AOL and Time Warner. Now, Time Inc. had more than 70 years of history and owned iconic titles like Time Magazine, Sports Illustrated, and Fortune Magazine. They saw themselves as serious, old-fashioned, Henry Luce is a god with a public good is everything kind of mentality. Journalism is life, and these print products will last forever. But by 1989, its biggest moneymaker was HBO and its video division. And it was one of those things where not everyone inside of Time Inc. wanted to celebrate the fact that HBO was the biggest moneymaker, or even acknowledge that by 1989, the future was video. But it had to be acknowledged. Now, on the other side was Warner Communications, who could not have been any more different. Warner's was run by Steve Ross, a former funeral parlor owner turned media king, who built a creative empire by showering all of his lieutenants with autonomy and money, and they loved him for it. They were fiercely loyal of Steve Ross. Steve Ross is a fascinating guy. I think he'll be the next mogul we'll cover. Warner's owned a number of iconic brands, which were basically fiefdoms for all of these executives, like Warner Brothers Studios, Warner Music, Atlantic Records, stuff like that. And they're home to moguls like Terry Semel, Bob Daly, Mo Austin, Ahmet Erdogan, David Geffen, and many more. Yeah, big names, big moguls themselves. And these guys made a ton of money. The perks were unbelievable. They operated basically with total autonomy, as if it was their own company, right? And taste and all that. And that's what Ross wanted. He wanted these guys to be tastemakers. He wanted them to look rich. He wanted them to be rich, provided they just delivered the goods, which they all did because they dominated these industries, right? So yeah, these two cultures, one of which all the senior executives are making tons of money. And then the other, they're super serious about the work. Tweed jackets, mahogany paneled walls, stuff like that. Oil and water. Throughout their negotiations, Time didn't see Warner's as an equal. More like they were beneath them. But everything changed in the summer of 1989 when Paramount, which was then Gulf and Western, launched a $12.2 billion hostile bid for Time Inc. To fight and stave off Paramount, Time took them to court, arguing they couldn't possibly be trusted to run its journalistic institutions. The moral character. And I'm not making this up. They actually went to court in Delaware saying that they didn't have the moral character to run these institutions. In the end, Time raised its offer for Warner's to $14.9 billion in cash and stock, not the previous stock swap agreement, but one which would require a lot of debt to go through. Thanks, Paramount. Paramount's hostile bid changed the history of media, because I don't know if Time Warner gets into the same issues with AOL, 10 years later. And so on July 24th, 1989, the deal was finalized with less of a merger and more of an acquisition by Time Inc. of Warner Communications. Not that Warner's ever acknowledged that Time was buying them, because Warner's is full of guys with bravado. They basically acted like, hey, we're taking over. We own this place now, which created Time Warner, the biggest media and entertainment conglomerate the world had ever seen. The deal brought together a powerhouse lineup. Time brought Time Magazine, People Magazine, Money, Sports Illustrated, Fortune, along with HBO and Time Life Books. It's a lot of stuff, right? Meanwhile, Warner's brought Warner Brothers Studio, Warner Music, Atlantic and Geffen Records, a major book publisher, and its cable systems. And that's important because they have distribution. We kind of underplay the distribution angle, but the cable systems are extremely important because they're local monopolies. Together, they created a media giant spanning cable TV, publishing, film, and music. John Reedy of Drexel Burnham Lambert called the deal mind-boggling, telling the New York Times, quote, "What you've got is a company that will be the largest magazine publisher in the country, the world's most profitable record company, a cable television entity with more than 5.5 million cable subscribers, one of the world's largest book publishing operations, and the country's largest supplier of pay cable programming," end quote, and that's HBO. As part of the deal, they expected a number of synergies between divisions with their newfound scale. They always do, right? And the fact is, we keep on repeating these things over and over, and do we ever get them? Not with Time and Warner. They expected better relationships between Warner Brothers Studio and HBO, because HBO is making their original movies now. Not many TV shows yet, but they want to use the studios. But that was wishful thinking. With the number of egos clashing in this deal, and with the amount of debt they were taking on, things were not off to a good start. Still, Time Warner's advantages were massive. Their scale was basically incomprehensible when you look at Ted Turner, and he has 4 cable stations at this point. That's not enough. And I just need to remind you, the internet has not disrupted anything yet. Like, no one has the internet in any conceivable way. It's not in these guys' heads yet. These guys dominate all of programming. George Schweitzer, who is the senior communications VP at CBS, said, quote, "If this merger goes through, it's another example of how all of our competitors can build very powerful communication complexes while the networks are held back by 20-year-old regulations, which are now increasingly unfair and outmoded," end quote. So basically, the CBS team is saying, we want to do this stuff. Why can't we do this? And the answer is regulations for the most part. Now, it's worth noting that in 1989, the networks still weren't allowed to own cable TV systems. Meanwhile, Time Warner could create TV shows and then distribute them on their own cable systems. Then they could also syndicate those shows in Europe or Asia, globally. And that's the power of vertical integration. It's a lot of power, right? That's what you want. Schweitzer added, quote, "This is an example of how software suppliers and cable distributors can do things the networks cannot," end quote. And Schweitzer's right. But this is where the new cable guard wasn't just catching up to the networks, but they were actually surpassing them while leaving the broadcast giants begging the government to modernize the rules, to make it more fair so that CBS, ABC, and NBC could compete. Now, to tie a bow on our Time Warner deal for now, I'm going to quickly tell one of my favorite stories from the deal. Now, more than once, Time Inc.'s Nick Nicholas had tried to buy a big stake, if not all, of CNN. Later, he'd even admit that not buying CNN was the biggest mistake of his career. But knowing this, knowing how bad Nicholas wanted it, Ted loved to needle him about it. And how, oh, you're not going to get CNN, and vice versa. Nicholas always liked to needle Ted about it. He would plant stories in the Wall Street Journal and New York Times that Ted was about to retire. Just needling him. They're friends. So, when the Time Warner deal closed, Ted decided to send Nicholas 24 red roses in response. It wasn't mean-spirited or anything, just some good old-fashioned joshing between media moguls. Awesome. By 1990, cable's total revenue reached $17.8 billion, almost double the $9 billion generated by the three major networks. While network ad revenue was flat, cable advertising was surging, more than doubling over the last 5 years to nearly $3 billion. The remaining revenue came from carriage fees, giving cable a two-stream revenue model that the networks couldn't dream to match without government intervention, right? Now, keep in mind, the networks relied solely on advertising, which was an approach that had served them very well since the beginning of not just TV, but radio. And in contrast, cable channels like CNN not only sold ads, they also charged fees to the cable systems. And so those systems then passed those costs off to their subscribers. It's where you get the bundle. And now, remember the Cable Act of 1984. They can raise their rates as much as they want. And in the end, everyone benefits, except for the customer later. Remember, just a decade earlier in 1980, the same year CNN launched, the networks controlled more than 60% of all advertising dollars. Not just TV, all advertising. By 1990, that number dropped below 50%. And for the networks, things were only going to get worse. But for cable, the sky was literally the limit. Okay, we're going to shift from M&A to where CNN stood in the late 80s and early 90s. And I'm going to do that by discussing 3 moments that I think personally marked their true coming out party as a network and worldwide leader in news. Now, if you want to dive deeper into CNN's earliest years, I suggest checking out episodes 6 and 7. It's the origin story, the launching, the building, and then competition, and really how they made it out of those first 3 or 4 years, which was really tough. But it's worth remembering when CNN launched in 1980, only 1.7 million homes in the United States could get it. Ted Turner put up $24 million of his own money on a do-or-die bet that Americans would want an alternative to the network's short, hyper-curated, really well-packaged news every night. He thought they wanted to know what was happening around the world in real time. And he was right, even if a lot of people told him he was totally insane to do it. In doing so, Ted didn't just build a new kind of TV network. He created something unprecedented. A new way to broadcast live from anywhere in the world in real time, and thus shrinking time and space for good. Now, I feel comfortable saying that Ted always expected CNN to be successful, provided he got enough distribution and advertiser appetite. But in terms of the programming concept, he was a believer from day one. Now, he was never a fan of news in the early 70s, but once he decided to do CNN, he was all in. That's just who he is. No negative thoughts. It's all, we're doing it. We're all in. Let's go. That's kind of how you have to be when you're making programming. You have to believe it, sometimes even to the point of delusion. When I tell people about these 4-hour episodes, they're like, are you out of your fucking mind, Webb? And I said, no. Dan Carlin does a great job with Hardcore History. Why can't I do it? I'm not trying to do founders here. I'm trying to do what I can do best to my best ability, right? Now, once you decide stuff like this, you can't be half in. You can't put one foot in the pool and say, yeah, I went swimming. No, you really got to be confident. You got to be all in. I'm all in on the show. I'm all in on High Bar and audio. And, if someone says, are you not confident? What happens if it doesn't work? It says, oh, then we move on to the next project, right? If something doesn't work, sometimes it's just ahead of its time. Sometimes it's not, Now, remember, Ted knew the whole time that CNN was going to be a big deal. He told his co-founder, Reese Schonfeld, quote, we're both going to be the most powerful men in America, end quote. He told him that a year before CNN even launched. Ted understood the responsibility and power that came with doing 24/7 news. Still, by the mid-'80s, when Ted talked about CNN's future, he didn't expect many changes in the network's format or operations. Quote, 5 years from now, I don't anticipate CNN will look appreciably different on screen than it does now, end quote. I mean, if it's not broke, don't fix it, right? With CNN, his focus was simple. Keep improving their ability to go live anywhere in the world, anytime. So that meant investing in new technology, but also adding more bureaus around the world, beefing up the understaffed teams in DC and London, and really just keep doing what they're doing best. So as CNN kept growing domestically, Ted's attention in the mid to late 80s turned towards CNN's international presence and coverage. Lou Dobbs, a CNN anchor at the time, summed it up perfectly. Quote, Ted Turner is the CNN strategic planning department, period, end quote. By 1986, CNN was in over 35 million homes. They went from 1.7 million homes in 1980 to over 35 million homes in 6 years. That's unreal. That is a massive leap. Part of that growth came from cable's rocket ship, more systems, more people realizing, oh, there's a variety of stuff here. But also the Cable Act of 1984 and that deregulation and cable's vastly better programming options. But CNN's survival through those brutal first 2 years, where they fought off better funded competitors like ABC Westinghouse's satellite news channel, was an incredible achievement in its own. But you don't get brownie points just for beating your competitor. You need to stand a game and you need to make a lot of money. And they did. Still, their programming costs started to rise, likely exceeding $100 million in 1986. And by early 1987, Wall Street estimated profits between $15 and $20 million a year. At the same time, CNN was pulling in about $75 million in ad revenue, selling around 100,000 30-second spots at an average of $750 each. That might not sound huge, but 24/7, those numbers grow. Remember, back in 1980, ads were going for about $60 a pop on CNN. The networks were charging between $50,000 and $100,000 for primetime, so that's progress. Once CNN survived those early years, national advertisers started lining up, especially in the travel and financial industries. It's a far cry from today's wall-to-wall pharma and insurance ads targeting older viewers, because cable is mostly older viewers. That's the demographic on cable these days. Remember, CNN, a non-union shop who'd even invented the video journalist before MTV, the jack-of-all-trades type of role, wasn't just a place to cover news. It was a place where you could learn every aspect of the news industry, or the media business, really, and hone your craft and get good at a lot of different stuff, and then decide what you wanted to do. And sure, it was a pressure cooker, but it's the kind of pressure that delivered diamonds, not from dodging union rules or making sure you had your hall pass to get to the right department. You didn't want to get penalized like at the networks, and so that was a great place for young people to work. Now, was CNN an easy place to work? Not at all. It was 24/7. It never stopped. Just like its coverage. Journalist John Donovan, who joined CNN from ABC in 1985, said this, quote, if you like to do newsy news, it's here. My gimmick is that if a reporter standing before a building has a good story, we use it. I don't care if she's not pretty, so long as she's believable and there's some enthusiasm for her work. For me, this place is a joy every day. I get here at 6 a.m. every day. We have our assignment meeting at 8. Once I told Ted that when he said he was going to do 24-hour news, I didn't realize he meant we were all supposed to work 24 hours. But Ted helps. He's either a loose cannon or a free spirit, depending on how you feel. But never once, even when advertising is soft, or the war with ABC, have I heard so much as a rumor of cut back. He's not going to jeopardize the news coverage, end quote. By the mid-1980s, while plenty of network execs still mocked Ted, especially following his audacious CBS takeover attempt, they couldn't deny CNN's success. If they tried, they would look like idiots, right? That would be impossible. So while the haters at the networks complained, CNN kept scoring bigger and bigger scoops while expanding their household reach and growing their revenue year after year. And really, CNN represented the beginning of a new era of news, one we'd see accelerate even more with the internet, right? By the mid to late 80s, CNN was producing exponentially more news than the big three networks. Those same networks, each under new ownership and management, started to dial back their coverage. It costs a lot of money. They were spending over $150 million a year on 30 minutes of news a day. And so they're shutting down international bureaus, scaling back coverage. Meanwhile, CNN did the opposite. By November 1987, it had expanded its reach to 87 countries with 1,500 employees across 18 bureaus around the world, reaching 40 million cable homes. And keep in mind, at that point, only half of America was wired for cable. So, yeah, there was still a lot of runway ahead, A lot of blue skies, if you know what I mean. Now, CNN's growth wasn't just about staff, bureaus, or cable households. It was also about better technology. Technology that let them expand their coverage and go live from anywhere in the world in an instant. Now, I've talked about their backhaul system, where they have satellites that are just for CNN's use. The public doesn't watch those, but it allows them to bring in coverage from anywhere in the world, provided they had an uplink. Well, now CNN had the portable satellite uplink, which was small enough to carry on as luggage on an airplane. And these uplinks let CNN crews beam footage back to Atlanta within minutes, seconds really, making true live reporting from anywhere on Earth a reality. So now they don't need to just be in, say, like Jerusalem or Johannesburg. Now they can be on the battlefield. Now, another sign of CNN's rise came in 1987 with its move to the CNN Center in downtown Atlanta. You see, Ted had bought the Omni complex 2 years earlier in 1985 for $39 million, right in the middle of his attempted takeover of CBS. The complex, once home to an indoor theme park, now housed Turner Broadcasting's corporate offices, the Omni Hotel and Omni Arena, where the Atlanta Hawks played, a music center, a movie theater, a radio station, and a number of restaurants and shops, all of which were owned by Ted Turner, or at least the real estate was. Unlike CNN's old Techwood headquarters, where news anchors could hear WCW wrestling body slams from above, new high-rise was modern, technologically advanced, and far ahead of what the networks were using. While most network executives lived on the Upper East Side or in Connecticut, Ted still lived at CNN. Literally. Just this time, it wasn't on a pull-out couch, but in a $3 million penthouse apartment on top of CNN's headquarters. That's all in, guys. That is all in. Okay, now let's jump to 1989, when a series of major international events would unfold over the next 3 years, each showcasing CNN's power as the world's premier news network, while setting it apart from the big three. Let's start with their coverage of Tiananmen Square in June 1989. Then came the fall of the Berlin Wall on November 9th, 1989. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall, followed by coup attempts in the Soviet Union and Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in 1990, which ultimately led to the Gulf War, which was the first live war ever broadcast live in January 1991. Now, each of these stories was enormous on their own, like iconic, important moments that if you put together a montage of the 20th century, each of them is going to be on there, right? And just nailing one of them could be transcendent for a new network. But altogether, they transformed CNN and took it to a totally different level in terms of prominence and importance. And CNN was there every time, witnessing and broadcasting history live as it happened. They weren't just covering the news anymore. They were the news. In covering the world, international television news services, Louis A. Friedland wrote, quote, "By the time of the pro-democracy movement in China in 1989, world television had come of age. Every major country in Europe, Asia, and Africa received CNN, including China and the former Soviet Union. And the world's heads of state and foreign offices had begun using CNN as a medium of diplomatic exchange," end quote. CNN anchor Bernard Shaw later told Mike Shinoy in his book, Assignment China, that CNN's coverage of Tiananmen Square, quote, "I think you could say that was the beginning of the CNN effect, whereby time is truncated and reactions and decisions are made based on events as they're happening in real time, which puts a lot of pressure on foreign capitals," end quote. And that's true. So that's the CNN effect. By covering everything live in real time and the world seeing it as it happened, CNN changed everything. Newsweek perfectly described it this way, quote, "Karl Marx, meet Marshall McLuhan," end quote, McLuhan being the 20th century media theorist. And I love that. The CNN effect is real. And honestly, it doesn't seem contrived. People remember, oh, that's the CNN effect. And they know exactly what it is without having to think. A few months after Tiananmen Square, Ted Turner was proudly showing off a new Times Mirror poll that showed CNN was now the most believable TV network and ranked second only to the Wall Street Journal in overall public confidence. Writing in the Washington Journalism Review, former NBC president William Small said, quote, "The three major broadcast networks' monopoly on national and world news is now a shattered memory," end quote. White House Press Secretary Marlon Fitzwater told the New York Times, quote, "CNN has opened a whole new communication system between governments. In many cases, it's the first line of communication we have. end quote. Even the CIA was embarrassed that its intelligence often trailed CNN's coverage by hours, sometimes even days, had to start monitoring CNN 24/7. According to the New York Times, CNN had become essential viewing for world leaders like King Hussein of Jordan, Margaret Thatcher, and the House of Saud. And soon after CNN's groundbreaking Tiananmen Square coverage, Ted became the first entrepreneur to win the Paul White Award from the Radio Television News Directors Association, one of the highest honors in broadcast journalism. This from a guy 15 years before who said no news is good news, right? The award marked the beginning of many, many, many more honors and awards to come for Ted and CNN. And remember, before CNN's launch, critics doubted Ted could even find enough news to fill 24 hours. But as Bill Daniels recalled in Porter Bibb's Ted Turner biography, quote, "I was standing right next to Ted when he launched CNN. He turned to me and said, 'The day the world comes to an end, CNN will be there to cover it.' Now he's found so much news that he may not be able to make room for that story," end quote. Now, just 5 months after Tiananmen Square came the fall of the Berlin Wall. For CNN viewers, it was history unfolding in real time, proof that live global coverage could change how people saw the world, and maybe even reshape it. I mean, come on. Mr. Gorbachev.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Brought to you by Ted Turner's Cable News Network. Then on June 1st, 1990, CNN celebrated its 10th anniversary. The 24/7 news channel that many had mocked and dismissed as chicken noodle news, and the little network that couldn't, was now an undeniable success, with more power and influence than anyone ever would have imagined when they launched. By then, CNN had a lot to celebrate, as they were in nearly 60 million American homes and being aired in more than 100 countries. Not only that, even in 1990, CNN was already in 200,000 hotel rooms around the world, and if you walked into an embassy or a government office overseas, chances are CNN was on their TV. But Ted Turner and his team weren't taking a victory lap just yet. No, they were looking ahead. That's what winners do. They look to the next challenge, not what have we already done. They knew competition was coming. They didn't know where it was coming from, but they knew with a business this successful, it was inevitable that others would try to take them on again. And he wanted to cement CNN's global dominance. You see, at the time, 1990, CNN had over 6 million cable subscribers in Europe and around 40 million total viewers outside the United States. So they kept pushing, launching condensed versions of CNN in Greece, Spain, and Italy. Ted even arranged for an over-the-air CNN subscription service in Moscow. That's Russia, or the Soviet Union at the time. And that's pretty wild for a communist country to allow a, free speech, liberal democracy cable station that's telling the truth all the time in their space. They wouldn't let that happen now as much. And Europe was just the beginning. CNN was already on the air in Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. They were testing coverage in Korea, Taiwan, and much of Southeast Asia, meaning they were on 6 continents in just 10 years. Truly a global TV network. And if you wanted to take this on and really compete, there's no internet, so how do you do it? Think about that. Remember, when Ted launched CNN, a lot of people, mostly in media, saw him as a bit of a yokel, a rebel without a cause, a guy running around yelling about how bad the news was. No news is good news, right? But as CNN's Daniel Shore once said, quote, "Ted was a bundle of contradictions who does not fit any ideological stereotype and who speaks in generally conservative terms about the economy and domestic affairs," end quote. By 1990, Ted had broadened his worldview. Part of that probably came from owning CNN. Another probably came from being married recently to one of the greatest Americans of the last 50 years, Jane Fonda, 2-time Oscar Award winner, creator of Jazzercise, basically, workout videos, and a famous activist. He was at a foundation event when he said, quote, "It was a terrible realization for me to come to because no one loves our country more than I, but I have come to the conclusion from studying it from a global circumstance that we are the greatest problem in the world," end quote. And this is all while the Cold War was starting to come to an end. And China is ascendant. There's a lot of shit going down in the Middle East. And Ted really wants to fill that gap and tell the world what's actually going on. And while Ted saw himself as a great patriot, a great American, Even he admitted, quote, the national interest today is subservient to the international interest, end quote. And nowhere would that be more clear than with CNN's coverage of the fall of the Soviet Union and the Iraq War in 1990 and 1991, respectively. Now, on August 1st, 1990, Tom Johnson, the former publisher of the Los Angeles Times, became the new president of CNN, landing the job after a 15-minute interview with Ted. That's all it took for Ted to know Johnson was the right guy for the job. The very next day, Johnson's first official day on the job, Saddam Hussein's Iraqi army invaded Kuwait. It was an immediate baptism by fire. Johnson, a quick learner with an impressive Rolodex, stayed calm and steady. He led by supporting his team at CNN, drew on a decade of experience to prepare for what was now an inevitable war. From Baghdad, producer Robert Wiener speculated, quote, if we could somehow pull it off, it would be the journalism equivalent of walking on the moon. To cover a war live in real time from behind enemy lines in the enemy's capital, not even Murrow has done that. But I could easily imagine old Edward R. licking his lips at the prospect, end quote. Even in 1990, CNN prided itself on its objectivity. Ed Turner told Porter Bibb, quote, it's as though we were in training all this time for just this story. We worked harder to put the necessary technology in place to get the news out of the Middle East quicker than ABC, NBC, or CBS, end quote. You see, Saddam's invasion really was the culmination of years of preparation for CNN, not just logistically, but technologically. Remember, I mentioned those portable satellite uplinks earlier? You know, the briefcase-sized satellites that CNN could bring on airplanes and then basically broadcast from wherever. You know, nowadays we can do it with an iPhone, but back then it was the size of a briefcase. Well, no one else had anything like it. CNN also spent years building relationships with broadcasters around the world, including in Iraq, where Ted made sure CNN was available in their government offices. And this is before the war was even a thing. That same year, Iraq's television director general even visited CNN headquarters for a World Report conference. Easton Jordan, who was CNN's vice president for international affairs, said, quote, you have a meeting like that, and relationships are cemented. End quote. Now that investment between logistics, technology, you know, the uplink satellite, and the personal relationships were about to pay off big time. The kind of relationships that, you spend years building, and now the payoff. It reminds me of Anthony Bourdain's favorite quote, prior preparation prevents poor performance. Nowhere else would that be this evident, but in Baghdad. By 1990, CNN was ready for anything and everything anywhere. Now, months before war even felt like a inevitability, Easton Jordan began working to get better access inside of Iraq. He sent more than 100 letters and telegrams to Iraqi officials and the Iraqi ambassador in D.C. before CNN finally got permission to broadcast live in Baghdad. And unlike the broadcast networks, CNN was willing to spend real money to be in Baghdad, in Iraq, in the heart of the matter, just in case things started to unravel. Interestingly, they thought smart too. You see, Easton Jordan expected Iraq's communication system would probably be knocked out if a war began, airstrikes and such. So he pushed CNN to invest in portable satellite phones, which are basically the size of suitcases at the time, and those each cost $52,000. So CNN bought 2 of those suitcase-sized phones, and then less than 48 hours before the war began, CNN was given permission to bring in a $400,000 portable flyaway satellite transmitter, which sounds pretty complicated. I doubt it was as complicated as it sounds, but it doesn't matter. Now, this is on top of millions of dollars, which they'd already committed to spend covering what could become the first war ever broadcast live in real time on television. In Atlanta's headquarters, Jordan, Tom Johnson, Ed Turner, and the rest of CNN's leadership team were thrilled because they knew if war broke out, they'd be able to broadcast live, and no one else would. That's a huge thing, right? They would be the only network broadcasting live behind enemy lines. Prior preparation prevents poor performance, right? And throughout all this, Ted Turner was bursting with pride because his team was showing the same determination covering the war that they'd shown a decade earlier when they were getting up for launch. That attitude of we're doing this no matter what, from the feet up, matters. Now, Robert Weiner's team in Baghdad included Bernard Shaw, who was scheduled to interview Saddam Hussein on January 16, 1991, John Holloman, and Peter Arnett. Peter Arnett's a pretty big name, as well as a small group of cameramen, support operators, and engineers. And one of my favorite stories from CNN's Iraq War coverage comes from their new boss, Tom Johnson, who said he went to Ted with various spending plans ranging from $5 million to a top plan of $36 million and asked Ted, "What am I authorized to spend?" Ted tells him, "You spend whatever you think it takes, pal," which is kind of shocking, right? But what I love is how Johnson was stunned and amazed because then he said, "I'm not even sure he remembered my name." But Ted was backing his guy. You know, this is a big deal and Ted knows it. That's the difference between a programmer who's been in the weeds, in the details for years, and someone who's just a bean counter. So in early January 1991, Tom Johnson ordered a charter jet to sit on standby in Amman, Jordan, which cost $10,000 a day, just in case CNN needed to evacuate its Baghdad team fast. That's how dangerous this potential situation is. He also authorized Robert Weiner to have several $100,000 in cash on hand, just in case they needed to buy their way out of trouble. Think about that. Buy their way out of trouble. Hundreds of thousands on hand. Journalist Peter Arnett, who remembered the chaotic experience evacuating Saigon, even sewed $100,000 into the lining of his leather jacket, which he'd keep on for the next 6 weeks. Amazing, right? Now, when you think about all this, it's not just the bravado, but the courage and the bravery. And this is a real war zone that's about to explode with real bombs, bullets, and tons of unknowns. And they're doing this for the first time ever in real time on television. They're doing a service for viewers, something that, we used to only read about or hear about. And there's no BS, no committees, no long memos detailing everything they had to do. Their job was simple: get the story and get home safe. So on January 15th, 1991, as the United Nations coalition drew its final line in the sand with Iraq, halfway around the world, 45 journalists and technicians from CNN, ABC, NBC, CBS, and the BBC, along with all the major U.S. newspapers, magazines, and 3 international wire services, were all stationed inside Baghdad's Al-Rashid Hotel. Now, just a few days earlier, White House Press Secretary Marlon Fitzwater had urged all media to leave Iraq immediately, but most stayed initially. It's worth reiterating that these are all international war correspondents. They're hardcore about this. It's not just a job, it's a calling. This is the kind of thing where you're doing your job by staying. They live for this kind of thing. They expected a limited United Nations response and didn't want to miss the story. But what no one expected was the Iraqi government's preemptive media clampdown, which effectively turned the journalists in the Al-Rashid Hotel into prisoners. Now, the Al-Rashid was once a symbol of Baghdad's glamour. Now it was a crumbling relic, and its century-old wine cellars were quickly converted into makeshift bomb shelters. One day later, on January 16th, Press Secretary Fitzwater repeated his warning. American media needed to get its people out of Iraq now. But CNN's Peter Arnett told his team in Baghdad, quote, "Listen, guys, absolutely nothing's changed between yesterday and today except Fitzwater's announcement. It's obvious the White House doesn't want us here. They don't want any reporters here, but that doesn't mean we should panic. I say we stay, and that's that," end quote. Now, Tom Johnson, who, remember, had only been at CNN for, 6 months, suddenly had a huge decision to make. And history was repeating itself for the news executive. Because when he ran the LA Times, he'd allowed 2 journalists to stay in Nicaragua and Tehran, respectively, and neither came home. Which, talk about a lot of pressure, right? So for Johnson, this was painfully familiar. He had less than 24 hours to decide whether to keep CNN's 8-person team in Baghdad or pull them out. The broadcast networks had already pulled their people after the Bush administration urged them to get out. So had the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, Time Magazine, Newsweek, and even the BBC. But Ted was adamant. The decision to stay or leave Baghdad should be left up to each individual. Ted told Johnson, quote, "I will take on myself the responsibility for anybody who is killed. I'll take it off you if it's on your conscience," end quote. Now that's leadership, right? Johnson admitted, quote, "I frankly was about to order them back to Amman. I clearly thought they'd all get killed," end quote. But Johnson agreed with Ted. Then, just as Johnson was about to call Robert Weiner with the final decision, the CNN switchboard interrupted him. The President of the United States was on the line. That's right, George Bush, President of the United States, was calling Tom Johnson, working the phones, personally calling news executives, urging them to shut down their Baghdad operation and warning them that Baghdad was going to be very dangerous and that journalists were going to be in serious danger. After implying that an attack was imminent, President Bush added that he hoped at least, quote, his good friend Bernard Shaw would get out quickly, end quote. But President Bush's phone call only hardened Tom Johnson's resolve. When Ted told Johnson he supported his decision, no matter what, they called the Baghdad team together and said, quote, Robert, I am not, repeat, not going to order you out. Anyone who wants to leave is free to leave, but I am not going to order you out. Do you understand? Then Johnson continued, I assume this call is monitored, so I'm going to be as circumspect as I can. You know, there are a lot of, inviting, there are areas all around the hotel that the coalition is very interested in. Is there any possibility of moving to another location? End quote. Now, Robert Weiner was brave, but he was also very smart. He knew war was imminent, and as such, he'd already installed a special 4-wire phone line in the Al Rashid Hotel, which bypassed the hotel switchboard completely. That's foresight. That's preparation. The hotel's old wine cellar turned out to be one of the safest places in Baghdad. But Weiner was also reluctant to give up the perfect camera angle he'd already set up on the balcony outside CNN's suite overlooking downtown Baghdad. Weiner told Johnson, quote, I know what you're driving at, Tom, but it's simply not a viable option, end quote. So CNN's team of Robert Weiner, Peter Arnett, Bernard Shaw, John Holloman, along with the production crew, all chose to stay in Baghdad. All of them. I told you, it's a calling. It's not just a job. It was brave. It was selfless. They were literally defying the wishes of the President of the United States of America. And honestly, it's kind of surprising this story hasn't been turned into a movie. Maybe it's an HBO like made-for-television movie, but I think this could be even bigger, kind of like Argo, like an Argo fuck yourself kind of thing, right? Then, less than 12 hours later, on January 16th, 1991, the skies over Baghdad erupted as the first wave of bombers began their campaign. And while ABC, CBS, and NBC each struggled with scattered, unpredictable phone connections, the first day of Operation Desert Storm belonged to CNN. When Iraqi officials finally shut down the Al Rashid Hotel's switchboard, Robert Weiner's independent 4-line phone system became the only communication link to the outside world. Now, CNN wasn't the first network to report that the bombings had begun. That would be ABC. During the ABC Evening News with Peter Jennings, while he was on the phone with Gary Shepard in Baghdad, who said,
ABC's Gary Shepard is on the line now from Baghdad, where it is a little after 2:30 in the morning. Is Baghdad a dead town at the moment, Barry? I mean, Gary, in terms of perfectly silent?
Peter, it is absolutely quiet here. No activity whatsoever. Looking out from the hotel where most of the foreign journalists are kept, the lights of the city are still on. You can see right to the horizon, street lights, etc. But absolutely nothing happening here. It is dead quiet.
Then moments later, while on the air, Shepard reported seeing,
Peter, I am looking directly west from our hotel now, and throughout the entire sky there are flashes of light. It appears to be some sort of anti-aircraft fire, and as this occurs, the flashes continue throughout the sky. There's obviously an air raid underway right now.
Then his phone line went dead. So while ABC got the first scoop, CNN quickly seized control of the story and owned the night, dominating coverage with virtually no competition from any other news outlet. Think about that 10 years before. It would be impossible to imagine.
We have to go to Baghdad, Secretary. We're going to Bernard Shaw in Baghdad.
This is, something is happening outside. Peter Arnett, join me here. Let's describe to our viewers what we're seeing. The skies over Baghdad have been illuminated. We're seeing bright flashes going off all over the sky. Peter?
Well, there's anti-aircraft gunfire going into the sky. However, we have not yet heard the sound of bombs landing, but there's tremendous lightning in the sky.
I have a sense, Peter, that people are shooting towards the sky, and they are not aware or cannot see what they're shooting at. This is extraordinary.
And despite the obvious danger, Shaw and the CNN reporters kept their composure.
We are confined to the hotel. We can give this report tonight because we're on the 9th floor of the Al Rashid Hotel, which has a commanding view of this very flat city to the north, south, east, and west. And for about the last 2 hours, there has been enormous activity. And now we hear planes actually going over here.
Yeah, well, I'll see if I can see anything. All right. There's a plane nearby. Bernie, you can see something?
Right. It's broken out on either side of us here at the hotel. And I'm just going to be quiet and let you listen. The heaviest raid so far, so close in. Maybe the outskirts have been pounded this way, but certainly several planes came right over the hotel and hit targets within 1.5 miles of us. Bernie, what do you see on the other side of the hotel?
I just come back from the other side. I'm really wearing out trousers here, crawling on my knees and hands. But, gentlemen, does it occur to you that it is not accidental that we are still reporting to the world?
This government has told us frequently, including the information minister last night, that he wanted the press to stay here. In fact, he expressed anger that some of the press had left. He said the international press says it covers human rights. It should be here to see what the United States, the multinational force, is going to do. Now, I don't see any government officials around here tonight to assist us, but they have said that we can work here, and up to now, this has to be unique, that we are continuing to cover this story, to talk to you, despite a series of major impact bombing raids.
Well, I'm anxious for daylight to come. Maybe we can get some visibility.
Peter, look at this. This is a bright flash of light that seems to be, it came across from north to south and even came up here by us in the hotel, and there it goes. It's almost like a shooting star.
I think that shooting star is probably an F-15, John.
Yeah.
Just one comment. Clearly, I've never been there, but this feels like we're in the center of hell.
Then came one of the most unforgettable moments of the evening as viewers watched Bernard Shaw duck for cover after a loud noise shook the hallway just outside CNN's makeshift studio on the 6th floor of the aging hotel. Remember, they'd left the basement, the wine cellar bunker, to go record above in the studio that they had created. Shaw said, quote, "We've got to run. Somebody's coming in the door. We're going to hide," end quote. Crouched on the floor between rooms with Iraqi intelligence agents literally outside in the corridor, an unfazed Bernard Shaw kept broadcasting.
I'm pleased to report that we can go back to Baghdad now and our 3 correspondents there. Let's see who picks up the phone.
Just to explain to our viewers why you did not hear from us for a nervously long time. For the past 20 minutes, I've been hiding under a table. And what happened was the security people made a sweep. They got very upset that there were 3 mortals on this floor, and just 3 men standing in a hotel room. So I scampered to hide to make sure that if they pulled Arnett and Holloman out and took them downstairs into custody, at least there would still be one CNN person on the air. John?
I did the same thing you did, Bernie, only I hid under a bed, and it's amazing that somebody as large as I am can get under a bed that close to the ground, but I was able to do it at least. And these security fellows also took some of the videotape out of one of our cameras. They say we'll get it back tomorrow. I'm a little skeptical that we will, but it was the beautiful pictures that we took to go along with the commentary that you heard earlier tonight on CNN.
You keep using that word, beautiful. This is not beautiful to me.
That same night, Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney held a press conference and remarked, quote, "The best reporting that I've seen so far on what is transpiring in Baghdad was on CNN," end quote. Tom Brokaw actually turned to CNN's Bernard Shaw for a late-night update for NBC's viewers. As their interview wrapped up, Brokaw couldn't help but praise Shaw, Holloman, and Arnett, then looked directly into the camera and told NBC viewers,
CNN used to be called the little network that could. It's no longer a little network.
Now for audiences, hearing Tom Brokaw, the voice of NBC, praise CNN on the air, that says everything. And the ratings backed it all up. Entertainment Weekly reported, quote, 10-year-old CNN ordinarily scores less than 1/10 the ratings of either CBS, NBC, or ABC. But on January 16th, the first day of the Gulf War, 10.8 million households tuned in to CNN, end quote. And that number was low since it didn't count the hundreds of TV stations across the country that were plugging in to CNN's news source, which allowed them to, basically air CNN footage for their local news stations. And a lot of affiliate stations also pirated CNN so that they could give their viewers the only live footage coming out of Baghdad. Now, before January 16, 1991, CNN usually drew less than 1 million viewers in any given time slot. But during Desert Storm, that all changed overnight. At the height of the war, as many as 50 or 60 million people watched live, especially as Scud missiles were sent over Tel Aviv and Saudi Arabia. And throughout the war, one thing Ted made sure to do was maintain CNN's impartiality. But when CNN aired footage of Saddam Hussein showing off his American hostages, they got a lot of harsh criticism. People were accusing Ted of turning CNN into the propaganda tool of a madman. But Bernard Shaw pushed back, defending CNN's policy of neutrality. Quote, "There is no enemy. There is no friendly. I can't take sides when my work is seen and heard in 105 different countries. As an American, how I feel privately, that's personal. But professionally, I do not take sides. As a reporter, I'm neutral." End quote. Inside CNN, President Tom Johnson and longtime executive Ed Turner worked constantly to keep the coverage balanced, while also giving viewers something the major networks couldn't. Peter Arnett reporting from inside Baghdad. Johnson even insisted that CNN put a label on the screen, a graphic, reminding viewers that Arnett's reports were subject to Iraqi censorship, so that viewers understood the context. Stephen Hess of the Brookings Institute defended CNN's approach here, saying Arnett's reporting was valuable because it showed what the Iraqi government wanted its citizens to believe about the war. He said, quote, "It's different, but it's a service. There's no reason to believe we're being misinformed. What is new in this war is not censorship. Vietnam was the exception, a non-censored war. What is totally different is an instantaneous, continuous, and international network. CNN really is the story, and it's clear that we all have a lot to learn about this new phenomenon." End quote. To back up its on-the-ground reporting, CNN brought in 75 high-level military experts, including former defense secretaries Caspar Weinberger, Alexander Haig, Harold Brown, James Schlesinger, and Donald Rumsfeld, along with experts on specific Iraqi weapons, desert warfare, and Middle East intelligence, to further explain new developments as the war continued to unfold. By the end of the war, CNN had broadcast more than 400 individual analyses, which was more than 10 new commentaries a day, nearly 4 times as many as any of the major broadcast networks. And still, the criticism did not stop. Haters are always going to hate. That's the main lesson there. Tom Johnson explained, quote, "CNN has been ground zero for critics, for colleagues, for viewers, for families, for the military, for the newsmakers, and the news haters. I think we were fortunate to have on site, in the most difficult of circumstances, a seasoned combat correspondent like Peter Arnett, who was tested time and again. He was there so that all the viewers could be there and see as much as we could see. The people here have made news policies and decisions never before faced by journalists. There were no guidebooks, few rules, and a lot of professional landmines. CNN has written a new book." Then he added with pride, "And I feel CNN served its profession and its viewers with distinction." End quote. Now, none of this came cheap. In fact, CNN's Gulf War coverage was expensive, reportedly $1.5 million a day. But remember, Ted Turner had told Tom Johnson to spend whatever it took to get the story, and now they got the story, and the ratings, and the audience, and the acclaim. Now CNN was leasing more satellite time than all of the broadcast networks combined. So what made CNN's coverage of the first real-time live war so unique and different? Well, CNN brought the reality of war directly into people's living rooms. Americans were glued to their TVs as the war unfolded live. Terms like Scud missiles, Patriot battery, and Tariq Aziz suddenly became household names. But more importantly, CNN showed the brutal realities of war, and it brought it into American homes. It's very different to witness something as it's happening than to read about it in print, right? And CNN was the only network getting a live signal out of Baghdad while the bombs were falling, and they gave it all justice. Meanwhile, the major networks' coverage felt distant as they covered much of the war in the form of special reports featuring anchors safely sitting in studios. And that's not to diminish their journalistic chops or their bravery. I'm sure a lot of them would have bravely gone straight to Baghdad, but their executives wouldn't let them. CNN at the same time, though, was in Baghdad, on the ground, showing the war as it happened. And the ratings reflected that. Even President Bush admitted he couldn't turn off CNN. It was the only source actually showing what was happening. They weren't just informing the American people. They were informing the American president. Retired U.S. Air Force General Michael Dugan, who was working as CBS's military analyst, said, quote, "What CBS did during the Gulf War was watch," end quote. And then on February 28, 1991, 43 days after the war began, a ceasefire was declared. From there, Ted Turner moved fast. He was determined to capitalize on CNN's momentum. He opened a dozen new bureaus, including bureaus in Beirut, Amman, and Damascus. And each of those new bureaus cost more than $1 million. So he's putting his money where his mouth is. CNN's global footprint now stretched from New Delhi to Johannesburg to Buenos Aires. Tom Johnson said, quote, "CNN will continue to be what has been described many times as a lean and mean news machine. My mission is to balance editorial growth with revenue growth. We're not going overboard on expenses, and we are not about to begin paying megabuck anchor salaries," end quote. And all of this makes a lot of sense. CNN was almost everything the network news divisions were not. While Ted continued investing, expanding, and strengthening CNN's reporting around the world, the major networks who'd lost money because of the Gulf War coverage was largely commercial-free began tightening their belts. And the first place they tightened was in their newsrooms. What's truly remarkable is just how fast all this happened. Think back to our 6th and 7th episodes. CNN started as chicken noodle news to everyone else. People laughed at it, especially in the networks in Midtown Manhattan. But by the time the Iraq War began, which was only 10 and a half years after CNN launched, it had already become a global brand, a standard for the news. And it wasn't just about ratings. It was about their ability to collapse time and space and connect audiences everywhere at the same time. By 1991, CNN's biggest impact was how it changed the way we saw the rest of the world, but also how the world saw us. The CNN effect, right? CNN filled a void that just 10 years before, no one even knew existed. As global communications shifted into a real-time information age, there was simply no better source for fast, reliable news than CNN. In the months that followed the Gulf War, awards started to pour in. CNN won a Peabody and a National Headliner Award, and then Ted was named Times Man of the Year, which would later be called the Person of the Year, which is pretty incredible for Ted Turner, right? But by now, we all know that industry acclaim wasn't what drove him. What CNN's coverage of Operation Desert Storm showed was that CNN wasn't just an extension of the American news system, but a truly global network with a global mission. The political and journalistic impact was undeniable, but where it would go in the next 10, 15 years was unpredictable and often uncontrollable. According to CNN President Tom Johnson, CNN spent $22 million covering the war, which was a lot more than the broadcast networks. Now, doing the math myself, it seems like it had to have been a lot more than that. And while CNN was investing in their future, the networks were bleeding cash. Case in point, in the first few days of the war, each network was losing up to $6 million a day in lost advertising revenue because they were live without commercials. NBC later estimated their coverage from August 2nd's 1990 invasion of Kuwait to the ceasefire in February of 91 had cost them $50 million. Unbelievable. And I don't know if that's cash or lost revenue, maybe a mix. And I've said it many times, they just didn't have the systems, or better yet, the constraints to tell the news in a cost-efficient way, especially abroad. So what caused the sudden collapse of network revenues? Well, Canaletta listed a number of factors like a recent recession that slashed advertising budgets, but also that shrinking network audiences pushed advertisers to explore other options. And attempts by the networks to compensate by adding more commercials, in the case of ABC, 4% more, 8% more commercials on NBC and CBS, backfired, pushing viewers further away. And it's not like the viewers knew there were more ads, but viewers are smart. They sensed it. They noticed that they were being fed more advertising. But the real shift was this. Advertisers finally realized that network airtime, with all these new cable channels, wasn't scarce anymore. And once scarcity disappears, so does leverage. The reality was laid bare during the network's lackluster coverage of the Gulf War and CNN's incredible coverage of the war. Ted Turner understood something his corporate peers didn't. Audiences wanted to watch news live as it unfolded, and not just polished, near-perfect packages hours later, sometimes a day later. And it's not necessarily their fault. They just didn't do what Ted did, which was say, we're staying in Baghdad to get the story right. Former CBS president Rick Kaplan explained that Ted, quote, had an idea for CNN, and that idea was not, I got a great way to make some money. Some people would think, oh, look how much money I can make from cable news. I don't think his thought was, here's a great way to make a killing. I think his thought was, this is something that would be great for the world, end quote. Now, I completely agree. It has to come from loving the programming, from wanting the world to have it. Now, in a less quantifiable way, the Gulf War cost the networks even more. Their decades-long hold on viewers' trust, where they were seen as the authoritative voice and source of news, was suddenly in doubt. CNN was the revolution. CNN reporters were on the ground, risking their lives. And that's not to say the networks weren't, being in Kuwait or Jordan or even Tel Aviv, where Scud missiles were headed their way. But to audiences, they didn't see them the same way that they saw the CNN guys. CNN had actually earned a new level of trust and respect, while the networks were still playing a safer, slower game, and on a much more limited scale. Think about it, 24 hours a day versus 30 minutes at night. I mean, there's no contest, right? Like the aforementioned Mike Tyson once said, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. Well, Ted Turner's CNN had straight up punched the networks in the face, and they didn't have a backup plan. By mid-1991, the networks had cut back from 9 overseas bureaus to 4. Their combined nightly news audience had dropped to just 54% of TV viewers, losing nearly a third of their audience in less than a decade. Suddenly, the question wasn't just, does network news have a future? But do the networks themselves have a future? That's a real question happening in 1991. And then, in August of 91, came the Soviet coup attempt, when party conservatives, the real communist hardliners, attempted a dramatic seizure of power by placing General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev under house arrest at his retreat in Crimea. Defense Minister Dmitry Yazov helped declare a state of emergency across the Soviet Union. And, as the Soviet Union started to collapse, CNN caught it all in real time. Over the next 3 days, the world watched the first ever instant revolution, that's what it was called, broadcast live on, you got it, CNN.
This is CNN.
Now, a big reason CNN was able to even cover the fall of the Soviet Union so well was because of the years of Ted's relationship building in Moscow through the Goodwill Games, which he launched after the 1980 Olympics, where we decided not to go to Moscow, and the 1984 Olympics, where the Soviets did not come to Los Angeles. And in early 1990, Turner Broadcasting became the first Western broadcaster carried on Soviet TV. This was essentially the final building block Ted needed to fulfill his vision of a global network, right? On that vision, Ted said in 1990, quote, we're already there, but it needs a little more refinement and a little bit more coverage and a little bit wider spread. But it's happening. It's already happening. He added, I think news is becoming our most important asset. Almost by default, that's the big thing. If you were managing one thing in the world, wouldn't the global flow of television news be as big a thing as you could possibly? I mean, the first global broadcast network? End quote. By 1991, CNN had better contacts than the Kremlin, as they aired protests across the Soviet Union to their global audience.
Repeating once again our top story, Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev has been removed from power, and there are tanks now in the streets of Moscow. Vice President Gennady Yanayev says he has taken over as acting president as the head of state of a special state committee. You're watching live pictures from Moscow this morning. He has declared a state of emergency in individual localities. It is not clear what that means.
By the time the coup began in August, CNN was more than ready to cover every aspect, from the coup attempt to the instant revolution to the fallout. They weren't lucky, they were prepared. And chance favors the prepared mind, right? Even though the coup leaders controlled Russian state television, they somehow, some way, could not stop CNN's satellite signal from getting out. People in Latvia, Armenia, Lithuania, Moldova, Estonia, and Belarus watched live as Boris Yeltsin climbed onto a tank and called for the coup to end. And Ted? Well, Ted watched these events unfold on his own network and wept openly. Not only did he consider Gorbachev and Yeltsin his friends, but he considered all Russians his friends. The man who launched the Goodwill Games to foster peace between the world's two superpowers now found himself influencing the future of the biggest rival of the United States since 1945. And it's no surprise that this coverage, combined with CNN's coverage in Iraq, landed Ted on the cover of Time magazine as their 1991 Man of the Year. In 1991, the three networks together spent about $1 billion on news, while CNN spent around $200 million and still outperformed them. By 92, CNN was earning more than CBS, NBC, and ABC, not just in news, but overall. And remember, CNN did all of this while keeping its operation costs far below what each network spent just on their news divisions. And while each network approached Ted about pooling resources to share costs, none of those deals really materialized. They didn't really want them to. They liked those big budgets. I mean, I get it. Because at the end of the day, CNN and the networks lived in two completely different worlds. Oil and water, right? Their cultures were night and day. That was true in 1980. It was true in 1991. And it was still true in 1992. Now, even as CNN rose to global prominence in 91-92, salaries remained much lower than at the broadcast networks, though that gap was starting to close. In 1992, CNN started correspondents at $60,000 to $70,000, while the broadcast networks typically paid new reporters around $100,000. By this point, Ted had also secured more satellite transponders to expand CNN and his other networks globally than anyone else. CNN was operating on 8 different satellites, giving it the largest and most flexible global footprint of any broadcast service in the world. By splitting the satellite signal into regions, Ted could offer advertisers targeted market coverage, often in local languages, something the networks simply could not do, nor would they really want to. They were so focused on the United States. They weren't global in reach. CNN was. And none of this was easy, nor was it cheap. But Ted became the only broadcaster offering continent-by-continent advertising, with the long-term goal of eventually offering country-specific local language versions of CNN. For Ted, this was the future of global news. And this is where we're going to start to talk more about the long-term plan with CNN and where was competition going to come from, you know. Remember, the internet doesn't exist yet. I mean, it kind of does, but not like the internet, you know. And the idea of hundreds of cable channels was still just a John Malone talking point at cable conventions. But Ted's vision for CNN in the next decade, from say 1992 to 2002, was already pretty clear. More global, but also, as it got more global, it would get more local, meaning Russian versions of CNN, Chinese versions of CNN, regional CNNs everywhere. And where were the networks during all this? Well, they were pulling back, scaling down their overseas coverage, and trying to stabilize themselves before so that they could potentially grow later, which they did in the mid-90s. As iconic CNN journalist Christiane Amanpour later observed regarding network coverage overseas, quote, "Unless American soldiers are there, American television is not there," end quote. But CNN was. Now, by 1990, just as CNN was about to go from a network to a necessity, Turner Broadcasting's liabilities still exceeded its assets by nearly $500 million. Over at TBS, 1992 marked its first net profit in 7 years. They even issued their first dividend since 1975. And even though they had $1.8 billion in long-term debt, it was no big deal because it was all, you know, long-term. They had more than $600 million in unused credit lines and more than $300 million in free cash flow. It's all manageable. Something I'm sure Ted wished he could just use to pay off the guys on his board. But they weren't going anywhere, right? You know, hey, can I pay you all off? Can you all please go away? You saved me, but now we're making money. Can I have my company back? Meanwhile, the cable industry was booming. By 1991, cable revenues had soared to $18 billion compared to just $9 billion brought in by the 3 major networks. At NBC, Jack Welch bluntly summed up the shift, quote, "News is not the core of the asset," end quote, meaning news was no longer a thing that would define a network, because now news lived on CNN, local stations, and pretty much everywhere else. Their competitive advantage was gone. The trust eroded. Now, they're just a highlight reel at 6:30 p.m. every day. By 1991, nearly 60% of American homes had cable TV. That's a massive shift compared to 1976, when only 15% had. Plus, almost 75% of homes had VCRs, and now viewers had access to over 33 channels, with systems capable of carrying nearly 200. And in this new media environment, CNN had a head start with their global reach, which had multiplied 76-fold since launch. Think about in episode 6, when CNN launched in 1980, they had 1.7 million households and brought in $7 million in their first 6 months. They lost money in their first 5 years. By 1992, CNN reached 136 million viewers, generated $536 million in revenue, and earned $155 million in profit. Not bad, right? Now, the thing is, after CNN's incredible success in Iraq and Soviet Union, Ted knew competition was coming. There'd be new challengers at home and abroad. And we're going to dig into all of that in the next episode. But what's interesting isn't who CNN would end up competing with. It's how differently the decade would unfold compared to what everyone else imagined in 1991, including Ted Turner. But for now, let's move away from news and move on to production companies, acquisitions, cartoons, and the much bigger questions and threats that were starting to build in Ted Turner's mind. In Ted's memoir, he summed up Turner Broadcasting's strategy for the 90s. Quote, "Moving into the 90s, my basic strategy for our company was clear. I wanted to own as much programming as possible and to air that product on the networks we owned and controlled. My continued hope was that one of these networks would be ABC, NBC, or CBS, but it didn't look like my directors from Time Warner, the name of the company formed after the 1989 merger of Time Inc. and Warner Communications, were going to allow that. But cable continued to grow, and the success of TNT encouraged me to look for more opportunities to launch new entertainment channels," end quote. Now, for many creatives or programmers or people just in the media industry, ideas tend to come from years of gestation, influences from their childhood, teenage years, even college, whether that's music or movies, or even, like for me, it would be MTV, specifically MTV in the 90s. It was like a revolution to me. And Ted Turner was no different. He even named one of his children Rhett after Rhett Butler in Gone with the Wind. So popular culture does seem to play a very important part in media folks' careers, because no idea is ever truly novel or unique. It's just a spin on something that's been done before. So when Ted heard in 1991 that Hanna-Barbera, the animation studio behind the Flintstones, the Jetsons, and Yogi Bear, to name a few, might be for sale, his ears immediately perked up. Now, Ted always loved cartoons, going all the way back to the earliest days of WTCG and his childhood, and then the Superstation, because cartoons always performed well on his programming channels. They were popular, family-friendly, timeless, and in his mind, just good fun for everyone. So, in 1991, Ted decided to make a move while also challenging his board's veto power by offering $320 million to buy the struggling Hanna-Barbera studio, which included all of its IP and decades-old cartoon library. You see, Hanna-Barbera had thrived in the 60s and 70s thanks to their cheaper methods of animating and their style. But by the 80s, the studio had fallen behind. Disney seemed like the obvious buyer for Hanna-Barbera, but Disney's CEO at the time, Michael Eisner, passed after offering $200 million, which was far short of Hanna-Barbera's $312 million asking price. In one deal, Ted could now control more than 3,000 cartoons, which would be nearly 40% of all the animation ever produced in the United States. But for Ted, this move wasn't just about acquiring more programming. He had a much bigger goal in mind. He explained, quote, "If we could buy Hanna-Barbera and combine their library with Warner Brothers, which had Bugs Bunny, Daffy Duck, etc., and MGM, which had Tom and Jerry, animation that we had acquired when we bought MGM, we'd own about 2/3 of all the cartoons ever made. Our plan was to use those shows to start a channel that ran nothing but cartoons, 24 hours a day. True, the Disney Channel and Nickelodeon ran some animated shows, but no one was doing non-stop cartoons. And with this great animation library, this would be as much of a no-brainer as 24-hour news had been. Just as it never made sense that people could only watch the news at 6, 7, and 11 p.m., why should kids have to wait until Saturday morning for cartoons? I also like the fact that Hanna-Barbera's shows were all wholesome and family-friendly, not full of all the violence that seemed to be working its way into kids' animation in those days. For a little over $300 million, I'd be buying the opportunity to launch a unique and valuable cable channel," end quote. So Ted's plan was simple. Use this enormous animation library from the MGM purchase, buy Hanna-Barbera, and then launch the world's first ever 24-hour cartoon channel. This was a no-brainer for him, but he still needed board approval. And to his surprise, this time, no one fought him on it. The board saw it as a new growth opportunity and leverage against Disney and Nickelodeon without the same conflicts of interest from the days of FNN, Financial News Network. Ted said, quote, "Once again, I needed approval from my board, but on this occasion, it turned out not to be a problem. They had kept me from buying FNN out of concern we would become too powerful in news, but the kids' business would be a new growth opportunity for us, and as cable operators, they probably liked the idea of a competing channel giving them negotiating leverage against Nickelodeon and Disney. Time Warner could have objected or gone after Hanna-Barbera themselves, but Turner Broadcasting owned Warner Brothers' pre-1948 library, including the bulk of their classic animation, and that made the deal far more logical for us. We'd still have to figure out how to handle the financing, but the board gave me the green light. I knew Great American CEO Carl Lindner. We had always gotten along well, so I called him up directly. After the usual formalities, I got right to the point." Ted called the Great American CEO Carl Lindner directly, quote, "I understand that you're considering selling Hanna-Barbera. Is that true?" "Yes, it is, Ted." "And I hear you're asking $312 million for it." "That's right, Ted." And I said, "I'd like to offer you $312 million. Would you accept cash?" "Yes, Ted. I'm hereby offering you your asking price of $312 million cash at closing." And he said, "Well, Ted, you've just bought yourself Hanna-Barbera." Ted added, "It's a seller's dream of getting a call like this, but once again, this was an asset that would be extremely valuable, and I wanted to get it off the market right away," end quote. So Ted moved fast and bought the struggling studio, and almost immediately he merged Hanna-Barbera's catalog with the Warner Brothers and MGM animation libraries he already owned. Bugs Bunny, Looney Tunes, Tom and Jerry, and in the end, the deal closed in December 1991. Ted later said, quote, "It felt great having both Fred Flintstone and George Jetson on the payroll," end quote. Now, this deal only reinforced Ted's core belief or philosophy in owning as much of his programming as possible. He proudly stated, quote, "We control more of our own software than any other programming entity in the world," end quote. And I'm going to sound like a broken record, but again, everyone thought Ted overpaid for Hanna-Barbera. But once again, this is another case where he was able to prove his haters wrong by showing his incredible ability for turning undervalued assets, or underutilized assets is probably the better word, in the wrong hands into profits in his. Years later, he recalled, quote, "Several years after the launch, I was with Michael Eisner. He leaned over and said, 'Do you want to know the biggest mistake I ever made?' And I said, 'No, Michael, what was it?' 'Not buying Hanna-Barbera when I had the chance. I should never have let you get it,' end quote. And almost immediately after the deal closed in 1992, Ted announced the creation of a new 24-hour cartoon channel. Now, this is actually one of my favorite stories throughout this series or in media history, and it's one that shows the power of the founder and the owner versus consultant class and operating executive. And so Turner Broadcasting hires a bunch of consultants, and it's so that they can name this new cartoon channel. And, these guys are paid a lot of money, and they spend a lot of time, and they workshop, and they test all these different names, options. And then they're about to present their findings to Ted, and Ted walks in the room and says, "I've got it. It's a network of cartoons, right? Let's just call it Cartoon Network." I can imagine all their heads just being like, well, one, that's a great name. And two, damn it. Ted said, quote, "We played around with different names for the business, but we decided that such a powerful, simple concept, 24-hour cartoons, needed a simple name. We settled on calling it Cartoon Network, and I told Scott Sassa, the dynamic young executive who I put in charge of our entertainment businesses, that the channel would launch on October 1st, 1990 at high noon," end quote. Now, only Ted Turner could throw out months of expensive consultant work in 5 seconds like that. And he was right. We still talk about Cartoon Network. Guys, this is the power of a founder. Fast decisions, strong instincts, and no fear of ownership. Sure, it ruffled feathers, but it's his damn company, right? Anyways, heading into launch, things slowed down a bit. Not because of Ted, but because of the new 1992 Cable Re-Regulation Act, which made his cable partners more wary of adding new channels to their lineup because it limited cable channel capacity and required them to carry local stations for free under new must-carry rules. In other words, cable systems suddenly had less room for new channels. So getting the kind of instant nationwide distribution he got with TNT wasn't going to happen immediately for Cartoon Network. Eventually, Cartoon Network did get widespread carriage, but this moment reflected a larger shift in the industry. The government realized the Cable Act of 1984, which went into effect in 86, relaxed regulations too much, and now they were going to swing the pendulum back a little bit. How often do they decide to re-regulate? Did Ted and the Cable Cowboys like these new rules? Not especially, but they had to adapt, which was one of their best skills, right? Now, one outcome of this new law was that broadcasters could now negotiate for retransmission consent, which was something they had wanted all the way back in the late 70s, meaning they could try to get paid when cable systems carried their signals. When that didn't work, some took a different approach. Ted explained, quote, "The bigger station groups did a smart thing. They decided to create their own cable channels and told the cable operators that they wouldn't haggle over carriage over their over-the-air stations if they went along and launched their new cable channels. This was how Scripps launched the Food Network and Home and Garden Television, and ABC and Hearst, part owners of ESPN, gained carriage for ESPN2, end quote. Ultimately, Ted's cable partners agreed, and Cartoon Network launched on time on October 1st, 1992.
On behalf of the Turner Broadcasting System, I want to welcome you to the launch of the world's only and first Cartoon Network.
Within just 6 months, Cartoon Network, which brought in revenue from both ads and carriage fees, was delivering ratings double what TBS had projected. It was another major hit for the company. Now, I'm sure you're thinking, Webb, surely there's a failure out there somewhere. And well, yeah, not everything Ted tried worked. I actually love this part of the story because failure shows his imagination and just what he thought cable could do for everyone and how bold of a visionary he was, because some of the visions were hallucinations. That's just how it is. You can't have a 100% hit rate in the creative business, not in media, no chance. That's the problem with Hollywood right now. That's what they want, when in fact they're not making enough movies to cover the cost for all the others. That's the power law, babe. So let's talk about a few of the failures. Ted somehow convinced his board, $2 million, to test a airport channel, a network that would play in terminal waiting areas, kind of like CNN and CNN International does now. And they tested the airport channel in Atlanta, Chicago, and Dallas. It lasted 3 months because it did not have legs. Nor did his private in-store McDonald's channel, targeting kids and young men using his Hanna-Barbera library at McDonald's stores. Nor did the checkout channel, which Ted dreamed of seeing in the lines of some 5,000 grocery stores. But those were all small swings compared to his wins, because in the early 1990s, like they say in NBA Jam, Turner Broadcasting was on fire with CNN, TBS, Headline News, TNT, and the Cartoon Network, with more to come. Turner executive Terry McGurk, who by 1992 was the number 2 in the company, said, quote, "The one thing we do here is start new networks, build new networks, and market them," end quote. And with their 5 cable channels, the most of any company in the world, Turner Broadcasting was just getting started. Next came tapping into their deep film library with the Turner Classic Movie Channel in 1994, TCM, and then taking CNN abroad with CNN International. Scott Sassa explained Turner's growth strategy, quote, "We're really in the business of remarketing products. We buy as much software as we can and then find as many ways as we can to get it out there," end quote. And they got it out there. I love how they call programming software before software is really prevalent. And what's so smart about their model in the early 90s was just how far one piece of news could go. From live on CNN to CNN radio to local TV stations, through CNN newsfeed, to Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. All of this was the same programming, the same material, but it was repackaged. Ted had the perfect analogy, quote, "We're a lot like the modern chicken farmer. They grind up all the feet to make fertilizer. They grind up the intestines to make dog food. The feathers go into pillows. Even the chicken manure is made into fertilizer. They use every bit of the chicken. Well, that's what we try to do with the television product. Use everything to its fullest extent," end quote. And when it came to programming, make no mistake, even in the early 1990s, Ted was still the one in charge. Your title didn't matter as much, nor did committees. If Ted wanted to do something, especially when it came to programming, he did it. And nowadays we have this awful idea about micromanaging or letting people do too much. But if you're that good at it, you kind of got to let him do it. That's his expertise, right? It's kind of like telling Shohei Ohtani, no, you can't pitch. I know you're a great pitcher, but we want you just to hit. No, if you can do both, you do it, right? Especially if you have a willing participant. It just shows how hands-on he was. Even after being named the Man of the Year by Time magazine, he was still hands-on because he loved it, because he cared. Caring is important in media. Want some examples? Okay. Like when Betty Cohen, who's the president of Cartoon Network, told Canaletta about her first phone call from Ted. He asked her, quote, when are we going to put on the Flintstones? She also said Ted always, quote, rejected the word content, a buzzword embraced by businessmen who like to think of themselves as creative. He told her, it's not content, it's Gone with the Wind, end quote. Without going off on a gigantic diatribe, I could not agree more. You wouldn't say to a filmmaker, I just love your content, right? Or at least I hope you wouldn't. Anyways, I won't keep on going on this one because you know how I feel. Brad Siegel, who ran TNT starting in 1993, confirmed how hands-on Ted was. Quote, one of the great things about Ted is that he watches everything. Everything we make on the entertainment side, the pilots, the movies, the specials. Ted watches everything on tape. You always got a call, end quote. And that's what you want out of a creative executive. Even the CEO, you want their opinion because it makes you feel better. But it also, he got them to the dance. They weren't at the dance in 1970. They were hardly at the dance in 1980. And they got there because Ted cared. And when something was good, even if the ratings weren't, which happens often, right? Where you make something really, really, it's almost like art, and the audience just doesn't get it at the time, Ted would still call and say, quote, that was the right thing to do, end quote. That's what leadership is, especially on the creative side. Now, I'm going to paraphrase this part, but Canaletta made an important point about Ted's programming philosophy in the early 90s. Yes, he was frugal. He underpaid staff, resisted unions, and endlessly reran the same movies to keep costs low, like The Shawshank Redemption later on. But unlike the newer owners of the networks or most media moguls, Ted understood something fundamental, which was this. The programming business is very unpredictable, it's expensive, and there are no guarantees. And you can't measure creative success by a cost-benefit analysis. Ted knew that sometimes a noble failure could elevate a company's brand identity more than a cheap ratings win, which is why watching everything mattered to him. It's why all the little details matter. As Barry Diller told the Financial Times in October of 2024, quote, the individual at the top of the organization needs to be ultimately responsible for the creative output. That is not something you can delegate. It should be your very being. The most senior person should be on the line for the success or failure of their product, end quote. And, frankly, outside of Ted Sarandos, I can't think of that being the case at any of the studios nowadays. And when I say studios, I mean like the overarching company, like not the actual studio heads, but my friends, that's where we've lost in the last 25 years of media. They aren't responsible for the creative output. They're only responsible for the dollars. And when you stop going to the creative talent for new ideas and you just recycle over and over the old stuff, people get sick of it. People can tell. Still, by 1993, Ted realized something else. Owning a massive library of beloved classics was very important, but it wasn't enough. Turner Broadcasting also needed the ability to make new programming at scale. So in 1993, for a total of $667 million in stock and cash, Turner Broadcasting bought two film companies. First, they bought New Line Cinema, the production company behind Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Nightmare on Elm Street, and a number of other low-budget hits. They know how to make movies fast. And that deal cost around $500 million. The second deal was for Castle Rock Entertainment, which was founded by four Hollywood insiders, including Rob Reiner and George Shapiro. And they were known for making Seinfeld, A Few Good Men, and, of course, The Shawshank Redemption, which would soon run nonstop on TNT. That deal cost around $150 million. Now, buying each of these was not easy, And that's not because they didn't have willing sellers, but because of Ted's board's resistance. Ted explained his logic. Quote, in addition to launching new channels, I was eager to make sure that TBS and TNT continue to have access to new and better programming. It was good to have libraries, but without a studio, I worried that we might get cut off from new content. It would be like the United States having its oil supply cut off. We could survive for a while, but pretty soon we'd be in big trouble. When Martin Davis was exploring selling Paramount, we had conversations, but they never went anywhere. He knew that I had spending constraints, and he suspected correctly that my board didn't want me to buy a major studio. This was frustrating for me, as I thought it was obvious by then that owning production and distribution capabilities made sense. I think most of our board members knew it too. I was convinced that Jerry Levin and the other Time Warner directors would say they didn't want us to buy a studio because it was too expensive, too risky, or too distracting, but that what really concerned them was that we'd end up competing with Warner Brothers. The terms of their investment in Turner gave them the right to veto such deals, but it bothered me when I thought they would use their veto against the best long-term interests of Turner Broadcasting shareholders. I was determined to obtain production capabilities, and if they wouldn't let me buy a big studio, perhaps I could go after a couple smaller ones. End quote. Deals like New Line and Castle Rock aside, by 1992, most of Turner Broadcasting's new growth opportunities were outside the United States. Turner exec Scott Sassa said, quote, the line extension of all of our brands, that's a no-brainer. It's basically getting on satellite and getting out there and distributing the service. It's really just blocking and tackling the basics of distribution, end quote. I'm talking about their existing programming, dubbing it into Spanish, French, Portuguese, you name it, and then licensing all of that abroad. That's a big opportunity for them. And it's a simple idea, but a smart one. And it worked. Within a year, TNT Latin America, which launched in 1992, was already profitable. Even more impressive, in 1992, Turner Broadcasting recorded net income of $105 million on $1.7 billion in revenue, meaning in just 4 years, Turner Broadcasting had doubled its sales. Rocket ship, baby. And remember, ever since Ted bought the MGM film library, those movies became a steady, inexpensive source of programming, allowing him to spin up new cable networks like TNT, Cartoon Network, and Turner Classic Movies. Ted admitted to Canaletta that he took a lot of pride in all this, that he'd done it, quote, right under the network's noses, and for having managed to grow from 1,000th the size of the networks to 2.5 times bigger, end quote. In a 2001 New Yorker profile, Ted said, quote, they laughed at me when I started with CBS. They laughed at me when I started CNN. They laughed at me when I bought the Braves. They laughed at me when I bought the Hawks. They laughed at me when I bought MGM. I spent a lot of time thinking, and I did not fear because of my classical background. When Alexander the Great took control when his dad died, he was 20 years old. He took the Macedonian army, which was the best army in the world at the time, and conquered Greece. Got the Greeks to all join him, and they marched across the Hellespont and invaded Asia. They didn't even know where the world ended at that time, and he was dead at 33, 13 years later. He kept marching, he hardly ever stopped, and he never lost a battle, end quote. But the thing about Alexander the Great is he did die. He did perish. And much like Alexander the Great, who conquered the Western world in the 4th century BC, Ted still wanted to conquer his media world. But almost immediately after the Time Warner merger, the modern media landscape, one that Ted helped create, began changing fast. The big were getting bigger, and the small were getting eaten. Meanwhile, with all that legislation I just mentioned, the broadcasters had a way back into the game. By 1993, 2 opposing forces were happening at the same time. Viewers had more choice than ever before, 24/7 news, sports, movies, kids programming, but fewer companies controlled all of it. Consolidation was accelerating, and Turner Broadcasting, for all of its innovation, for all of its channels, they had more than anyone else. Still didn't own cable systems, newspapers, or a major broadcast network. They didn't own any distribution. Ted owned programming more than anyone else. He owned the Braves, the Hawks, even WCW wrestling. But in a world where scale was everything, the real question was, could Turner Broadcasting survive as an independent media company? At the beginning of 1993, Ted said, quote, I've been through a lot of campaigns. I'm only 54, but I've already got the mileage of a 150-year-old man. I'm like a New York City taxicab that has 3 drivers driving 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, end quote. Ted attributed his comeback to long workdays and owning most of his programming, stating, quote, "We control more of our own software than any other programming entity in the world. The same film that airs on WTBS was a likely product for TNT. Videos both in black and white and colorized versions were packaged by Turner Home Entertainment," end quote. And then one day in Ted's New York City office, with his foot against the coffee table and a bust of Alexander the Great looming above his head, Ted proclaimed, quote, "You need to control everything. You need to be like Rockefeller was with Standard Oil. He had the oil fields, and he had the filling stations, and he had the pipelines and the trucks and everything to get the gas to the stations. And they broke him up as a monopoly. You want to control everything. You want to have a hospital and a funeral home. So when people die in the hospital, you move them right over to the funeral home next door. When they're born, you got them. When they're sick, you got them. When they die, you got them," end quote. Then he grinned and added, quote, "The game's over when they break you up. But in the meantime, you play to win. And you know you've won when the government stops you," end quote. Now, Ted wasn't about to be stopped by the United States government. But as his media empire grew, so did his anxiety. So once again, Ted set his sights on buying a studio or a broadcast network, or at least arranging a deep partnership with one of them. But if none of those options worked out, then what would his next move be? Well, then Ted would need to make the biggest move of his life. On the next and final episode of the Ted Turner Saga, we'll find out what Ted's biggest decision is. It was grow or die, build or be swallowed, expand or get acquired. Soon we'll find out what happened to Ted Turner and Turner Broadcasting. And then we'll learn how the biggest shareholder of Time Warner would come to learn that his life's work had been taken from him in a backroom deal that stunned not just the media world, but the entire world at the start of 2000. This and more in the final episode of Season 1 of Media Moguls. I'm Web Barr, and this is Media Moguls, the Ted Turner Saga.